Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 8 of this public hearing. Mr Henderson.
Chair, our first witness today is Baroness Brinton.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good morning, Baroness Brinton. Hopefully you should have in front of you a file of papers, and we'll bring relevant documents up on the screen just to your right as well. Can you tell us your full name?
Sarah Virginia Brinton, Baroness Brinton.
And Baroness Brinton, can you give us just a little bit of personal background? Tell us briefly what you did before you got involved in politics.
I trained as a stage manager, and I worked at the BBC for some 8 years, and then went on to be a mature student at Cambridge, moved into business, and then I was bursar of 2 Cambridge colleges for over a decade, and then continued in education thereafter. I joined the Liberals in 1974 after the elections. Because of my job at the BBC, which was in production, I couldn't be more active than that, so I saw everything only from my local party perspective. I was an agent in the GLC elections in 1977 to my first husband, but apart from that and delivering leaflets, going on demonstrations, I didn't do much else. I became much more active.
Let me just pause you there. Thank you. And could I just ask you, thank you for all of that, but could you keep everything a little bit slower? You'll see the ladies in front of you are taking a transcript, and it helps if we slow down. So thank you. Yes, you said you were involved in local politics, and you were involved in the Liberal Party before it then became the Liberal Democrats in 1988 to 1992. Just do tell us a little bit about the roles you played in the party.
At that stage, very, very little because of my job. I mean, I was travelling all over the country. I was working in studio long hours. So I would go to executive meetings of my local party. I had no contact at all either with the London party, which was what we would now call the region, and certainly not with HQ. But my first husband was more active. He was approved as a candidate, and he certainly stood, as I say, for the GLC elections.
So it was in London that was your main
London
focus?
was my base, yes.
You are currently President of the Liberal Democrats. When did you start that role?
I started that in January 2015. The campaign was for 2014. I, by that stage, had ceased to be a councillor, which I'm happy to go back over if that is helpful. But in my role as President, I chair the party's federal board, and I am voted for by all the members. So it's like the leadership of our party. It's a full campaign, and I represent them. I'm now in my second and final term of office, due to end at the end of this calendar year.
And what are your responsibilities as President?
Well, apart from the practical ones of chairing the board, I would describe myself as holding the ring on everything to do with the federal party. The party, the Liberal Democrats, as well as the Liberals, are very devolved. And the members and the local parties would certainly regard as giving the power upwards both to the state parties, and the state parties, England, Scotland and Wales, are the federation. And the president must come from one of those 3 state parties.
And do you have responsibilities for matters such as discipline or safeguarding, child protection policies, any of that kind of thing?
I have no formal role, as the leader doesn't either, in discipline, and that's never been the case. Currently, we're in the middle of changing our processes. Over the last 5 to 6 years, we have recognised that having discipline processes, either run by local parties or at state levels, where elected members, elected onto committees, may have some role in discipline, has not been good. And as a result of that, we have now, through the membership agreeing it at conference, moved to a new system of an independent parallel structure headed up by members of the party who are lawyers but who are not allowed to be elected in any other role in the party. That's just about to start happening.
Thank you. We will come back to that at the end of your evidence, if I may. But can I, firstly, and for the bulk of your evidence, we're going to look at some things that happened in the past.
Yes.
You've kindly provided 2 witness statements to this inquiry. And I'd like to bring up the first of them now, please. That's LDP 00008. 18. Thank you very much. And Chair, I would invite you to just this statement in its entirety. Baroness Brinton, in this statement, you've dealt with a number of subjects that the inquiry has asked for a senior member of the Liberal Democrats to address. And I'm going to take you through them in stages. But firstly, if we look at the start of the statement, paragraph 1.6 on page 2, you've explained, paragraph 1.6, thank you, that you didn't compile this statement alone. You had a small working party to do it. Can you just explain for us how you went about producing this statement?
For something serious like this, the obvious people to speak to would be, first of all, those who are senior officers of the party. So the chief executive would be the person I would want to automatically include, because he obviously has access to records of anything that happened via the staff at HQ. But I would also turn to our senior people in Parliament, those who have been or currently are chief whips or leaders in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. So Sir Nick Harvey, as our current chief executive, was also an MP for some years, and certainly, although I don't think that he overlapped with Cyril Smith, he certainly was around with a lot of the MPs who did. And I also asked Lord Newby to assist, because he had been General Secretary of the SDP prior to the merger, and very involved in the party from the merger days, 88 on, and had been in the House of Lords for most of that time as well, and indeed had been Chief Whip in the House of Lords.
Thank you. So am I right to understand then that the statement you've provided is a joint effort drawing on not just the corporate record, but also the memory of those individuals you've named?
Yes.
And I understand as well that you actually spoke to a number of other people, and
yes.
If we turn to LDP 000010,
Sorry, which tab is that?
it's tab 4, sorry, Baroness Brinton, tab 4 in the bundles.
Yes.
And just on the second page there, thank you very much, we have a list of other people that you spoke with. And if we look down the list, we'll see the thing in common seems to be a lot of them were around at the relevant time. Is that
that's
right?
right, yes.
And when I say the relevant time, I mean, in particular, the 1970s and 80s.
Correct. Because sadly, obviously, a lot of the key people are no longer with us.
Indeed. Thank you very much. If we could go back to your main statement, please. And if we could go on to paragraph 3, which is page 3. Sorry, paragraph 3, which is on page 3. Thank you, that's great. Now, I'd like to ask you, Baroness Brinton, firstly about the historic structure and the procedures of the Liberal Party. And there are 3 broad periods I'd like to ask you about. The first is pre-1969, briefly, then 1969 to 1988, and then again briefly 1988 onwards. So firstly, can we have a look at pre-1969? And this is your paragraph 3.2. You explain here that the Liberal Party in the 1960s was very decentralised. Mm-hmm. Can you just give us a flavour for what it was like?
So these days, decentralisation, you would talk about a local constituency party, and they're mostly around the country. We've got those. But in these days, Liberal associations were not necessarily consistent across an area. They were usually where a number of people had come together and started to campaign and work. They didn't have to affiliate to the main national party. Right. So they could operate completely in isolation. And as has been said in some of the statements that have been made, that are presented here today, there were some arguments about new liberals and liberal federations and all of those things. I think it was recognised that basically 19th century system needed to change. And Joe Grimond was the last leader who was beginning to talk about changing that and bringing it up to date in the 20th century.
And you describe here that just at the end of that paragraph, in the mid-1960s, the party commissioned a constitutional review to bring the constitution up to date, and that was debated and voted on in 1969. Is that right?
Yes.
Could we turn, please, to... I understand that a lot of this information was drawn in particular from the recollections of a gentleman called Michael Steed.
That's right.
And if we could have a look at what he says, it's tab 5, Chair and Panel, and it's INQ, sorry, beg pardon, LDP 000011. Thank you. And if we could turn to page 3 of that. And if we zoom in on the second half of that page, beginning perhaps it was. Thank you, that's great. Mr. Steed was involved in the Liberal Party in quite a significant way from the 1960s onwards, as I understand it.
Yes.
And in particular, he was involved in a lot of this organisational change, and he describes it here. That first paragraph you've already summarised in the statement that we've looked at, but I just want to look down the second paragraph there. He describes something called the Sear Review. Can you just tell us a little bit what that is?
Nancy Sear was, at that point, one of the senior members of the party. In fact, she was then elevated into the House of Lords and our first woman leader in the House of Lords. So a woman who had, and indeed had stood for Rochdale in the 1960s.
I noticed that, the slight ironic twist.
Indeed. But she was accepted as somebody who was capable of undertaking such a review because she had known many of the people in the party over many years, and it was her review that started the process. But as you will see from Michael Steed's statement, it was a very, very slow process.
Indeed. I wanted to zoom in, if I may, on a statement he makes just at the second last paragraph there. You see right at the end he says, it's clear any changes were being brought into effect patchily and slowly, and were certainly not fully effective until after the 1970 general election.
I understand, I mean, this predates my involvement with the Liberals. I understand that part of the problem was they just didn't know where local associations were, and they needed to be able to sort all of that out and to try and draw people together to make sure that everybody had bought into things.
And actually we can see contemporaneous proof of that. If you turn to tab 27, and for the trial director it's INQ 003964. We have here from the Liberal Party archives minutes of a meeting of the National Executive Committee. Who are the National Executive Committee at this stage?
That is the equivalent of the current federal board,
right,
or the federal executive as it was before the board changed its name and remit.
So this is as close as we got to a sort of central executive function.
Yes.
We see this is dated 30th of October 1970, so some months after the 1970 election.
Correct.
And if we turn over the page to page 2, in fact, sorry, just for a second, if we could go back for a second to page 1, it's maybe just useful to see, we see some familiar names here, don't we?
Indeed.
So, in that list, thank you, we can see Mr. M. Meadowcroft about halfway down.
Correct.
And we've got a statement from him, we'll come to that. We can also see Mr. Lishman.
Yes.
Who I understand you've spoken to, and we'll hear about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then down the bottom, just above Jeremy Thorpe, Mr. M. Steed.
Indeed.
Again, if we can turn over the page to page 2 and zoom in on that section that says Candidates Committee Report. Thank you. And what we see here is essentially a discussion about trying to standardise how candidates are selected. And this is in October 1970.
Yes.
And if we look in the middle of the paragraph, we can see a reference to, this is still with the aim of producing a uniform standard and pattern of interview throughout the country.
Correct.
So even in October, still not happened.
Still not happened.
Thank you. All right. Can we go back to your statement, please? So that's LDP 000018. And page 3. So that's the pre-1969 process. You make a comment, Baroness Brinton, at paragraph 3.3. You say it's worth noting there's still a strong residual belief that parliamentary parties were governed by the British Constitution rather than party structures. MPs weren't accountable to their political parties as now. Can you just explain that? What does that mean, in particular, if an MP was found guilty or suspected of misconduct?
I think it means absolutely generally that the MP was representing their electorate, and it was in some ways almost coincidental that they were a member of a political party. And certainly from the leaflets that we may or may not come on to later about Cyril Smith, that is what you see. He is saying, I am your candidate. And we've always been clear, and we still remain clear, that the party cannot mandate MPs on how to vote. And so although the members make policy in our party, and indeed at this stage make policy in the party, it was up to the MP to make their own decision. And certainly that was also true at the time in terms of behaviour as well. There was no power over the party at all. The only relevance at that stage would have been, if there had been a problem, the Chief Whip, which is why obviously we were asking the Chief Whip.
Right. So would that mean that there was a reluctance to confront a Member of Parliament, a Liberal Member of Parliament, about misconduct because it was felt it wasn't really a matter for the party to do?
I can't comment on that because I genuinely don't know. I mean, I think the only parallel that I could draw is when the Jeremy Thorpe problem emerged prior to the charge, and that was mainly dealt with by the Chief Whip rather than the party.
We'll come on to that in just a moment. All right. Let's just zoom back for a moment and look at the period 1969 to 1988. And if we can look at your paragraph 3.1. Essentially, in this period, the party is still very decentralised. There is a new constitution, but as you say here, it's a mix of lots of different organisations, effectively, stitched together.
Yes.
And in many ways, the key person is the Chief Whip. Is that right, in terms of selecting candidates and having strategic responsibility?
Having responsibility for... I mean, I think I would want to make it clear that the Chief Whip did not select candidates or approve. They delegated others to go and do that. And in fact, the decision to select candidates, with the exception of by-elections where a different procedure was followed, was entirely in the hands of the local association.
That's fine, and we'll come to that as well. All right. And am I right that there was no major change until 1980? So between 1969 and 1980, there's no major change to the structures?
No.
All right, thank you. Can we move on then to your page 4 and just look at how allegations of misconduct would have been dealt with? So very broadly, if we have a look at paragraph 4.1, since 1988 and the merger, there are much more formal procedures and membership rules, as I understand it. And we'll look at those a little bit at the end of your evidence. But very briefly, is there a procedure now for dealing with a member, whether that's an individual member or an MP or a councillor, an elected member, who has been found guilty of some kind of misconduct?
Yes, there absolutely is. And perhaps I could distinguish between two things. This is about any complaint about misconduct which may or may not get to the point of going to the criminal through the criminal process.
Yes.
And what's more, it's all available on our website. So if a member of the public wished to make a complaint about a member of the party, whatever their role, they can access that and support in how to make a complaint through the party's pastoral care officer, who is there to help complainants.
All right. But prior to 1992, as I understand it, there were no established procedures at all. Is that right?
It was in the hands of a local party association or a state party to take whatever action they felt appropriate. The vast majority of cases were dealt with by the local association, and it would be only likely to go up to the state party or the regional party in the case of England if key officers were involved in one side or the other of whatever the dispute was. But it very rarely got to HQ. And I think the big difference between now and then is that we quite often at HQ would never have been aware of complaints and about processes of discipline because it was all dealt with at a local level.
Let's look again, if we may, at Michael Steed's recollections on this, because, as we've seen, he was there at the time and he supports exactly what you've said. So could we go again to LDP 000011? And that's tab 5, Chair. And we'll look at page 4 this time. And just down the bottom there, there's this heading that says Conduct of Party, Members of the Liberal Party. And Mr. Steed says this, he says, the SEER review, which you've already explained for us, Baroness Brinton, did consider whether the party should have a procedure for expelling members. But up to then, I think dealing with members who were politically embarrassing or whose behaviour was unacceptable was just a matter for rules of the Liberal body they joined. That's what you've told us. But then if we could go on to the next page, page 5, and up the top, that first paragraph, he says now, I cannot recall whether our consideration of an expulsion procedure embraced what to do about serious criminal or other objectionable behaviour. So even at that point, it wasn't clear if there was any real procedure. The main focus seems to be political views that didn't fit with the rest of the party.
Yes.
And then right at the bottom of that page, he summarises his recollections, final paragraph, by saying, although he explains he was involved in some of these disciplinary or misconduct-type investigations, he says, I cannot say, therefore, what action would have been taken in response to an allegation of child abuse on the part of a prominent member of the party. Given my involvement and experience in that period, I doubt there's anyone else who can truly say. I think if such an allegation had come to me while holding a responsible office, I'd first have considered it a matter for the police and looked to their guidance and observed the important principle innocent until proven guilty. But that seems to be about as far as we can take it, Baroness Brinton, in terms of what would have happened.
I think that's probably right, and other people have made statements to say that people like Ted Wheeler and John Spiller, when they had heard things, said you must go to the police rather than taking it back to HQ. And that is certainly the practice, as Michael Steed has said, that it was about making sure that something for the police went to the police.
But that would have meant, as you've said earlier, that the central party, such as it was, might not even have known about it.
Indeed.
All right. Can we look then finally at what would have happened if we go back to your statement, LDP 000018 and tab 1, and page 4 again. What would have happened if there had been an allegation made against an MP or a peer? And I think you've touched on this with the Jeremy Thorpe scandal. But paragraph 4.3, you say a number of the people you'd discussed this with said allegations would simply be considered by the officers or whips of the parliamentary party.
Yes.
Is that right? And what kind of action would they take?
They would have talked to the individual, and they would probably have also talked to anybody else who was aware of what was going on. Because other than the Jeremy Thorpe example, I can't give you any examples, I don't know, but it would have been the responsibility of the Chief Whip to do that, and certainly to question the parliamentarian concerned.
All right, thank you. Finally then, in terms of understanding all the backgrounds and the structures, I want to look at the selection of candidates in the 1970s. And you've dealt with this at paragraph 5.1 onwards of your statement. Can you just take us through briefly what you found out about how Liberal Party prospective parliamentary candidates, PPCs, were selected in the 1970s?
Again, the responsibility for anything other than a by-election was that the local association would advertise amongst their members and probably through the Association of Liberal Candidates at the time that there was a vacancy to be candidate. If somebody had already been approved as a candidate, that would not have been an issue, but there wasn't, certainly in the 1970s, very much structure. A lot of it was word of mouth. In order to become approved, you had to have an interview, and you had to have 2 nominees. These days, I think we would say references.
And who was the interview with?
The interview was most likely with a regional officer who may or may not have been the regional candidates officer, who had some idea, particularly after the SEER review, about what we were looking for in a candidate. But it was nothing more formal than that, and certainly not the sort of process that I went through in the early 90s, which was much more formal and tested a whole range of skills.
And any involvement at all from the Central Party, from the National Executive Committee or the parliamentarians, as they were?
Very, very unlikely, other than the chief whip at a probably once or twice a year meeting asking how many vacancies had been filled, whether we had candidates in the key seats. But there was no practical involvement about we need to get X into seat Y.
You say at paragraph 5.5, this is on page 5, that the arrangements for a by-election were different, however. Just tell us about that.
I mean, it's still true today that a by-election is a very different type of election. There's very high media coverage, whether it's local media or national media, and the level of campaigning, particularly if it's a hotly fought seat, is likely to require a lot more of a candidate. And as a result, particularly for one where we think we might win, then HQ does have a hand.
Does get involved. And is there any chance that that would be the same, not in a by-election, but a general election, but where it's a very marginal seat or where there was particular interest?
I don't believe so. Mainly because even with this arrangement where HQ is involved in the early stages, the final decision is still made by the members of that local association.
All right. Can we look at Michael Steed again? This is for the second last time. We're going to go back to him one more time after this. But LDP 000011 and look at page 4. That's tab 5 again. Sure. And under the heading Candidate Selection, he gives his recollections. And I just want to pick up on 3 comments briefly. Thank you. That first paragraph, he says essentially what you've just told us. My own recollection of becoming a candidate at that period, he stood in 1967 and in the 1970 general election, is how informal the process was. And he goes on to explain having a chat with both HQ and the regional party, but that was about it. And then if we could go further down the page and to the third and fourth paragraphs. He says 2 things here. First of all, it would be very difficult to state who ought to have exercised national authority over the candidate selection process in 1969-70 because of all these complications and the informality. And then he also says, the next paragraph down, it's very difficult to state who ought to have exercised regional authority. And is that basically where we've got to? It's all a bit murky.
Yes, absolutely. And later on he goes on to talk about how the perception was from Michael and his colleagues who were friends of Garth Pratt, who was the candidate who was displaced, that HQ must have had a hand in it. And
yes.
I have to say that the moment you have been elected into a senior position in the Liberals or the Liberal Democrats, you become the establishment, and our members love nothing more than blaming the establishment for things that go wrong. I think it would be very unlikely that HQ, which had a maximum of 10 staff, including field agents, would have had the capacity to start to intervene in places like this.
Thank you. Let's turn now then to the selection of Cyril Smith, because even with all of that background, there are some strange features about it, which we just want to explore. So Cyril Smith was selected as the PPC for Rochdale in 1970, as is now well known. And the background was Cyril Smith had been a Liberal member between 1945 and 1950, as I understand it. He then joined the Labour Party and was a Labour councillor from 1950 to 1967, and was very successful, as I understand it. He made quite a splash in Rochdale.
He did.
What was the relationship like between Labour and the Liberals in Rochdale, from what you've gathered?
It was not good.
Why was that?
Hard-fought elections, very tribal politics on both sides, and absolutely no love or caring to try and compromise at all. And I think Chris Davis, who has a statement later on, actually says they hated each other, and that is not far from the truth. So to have somebody who moved from being a Liberal to Labour would have meant that when Cyril Smith did that, the Liberals in Rochdale would have been appalled and horrified. Labour would have been equally appalled when he left them, briefly became an independent, and then came back to the Liberals. So there would have been quite a lot of people who were trying to work out what on earth had happened when he just came back into the fold.
And what have you found out about how that happened? Tell us about Garth Pratt, and it seems that he persuaded Smith, or was part of the persuading of Smith back into the Liberal fold.
The irony is that he persuaded him back in because he recognised that Cyril was well known, an excellent campaigner, and therefore would be an asset to the Liberals. And if you've been involved in a party structure locally, to then become an independent can be quite difficult, even if you are well known.
Simply because there's no support.
Because there's no support, yeah.
And you said it was ironic. Why was it ironic that Garth Pratt did that?
Because Cyril, however he did it, managed to get Garth displaced and to take his place in the run-up to the general election of 1970.
We will look at that in just a second. The other bit of the background, however, which is of course relevant, is that we now know that in 1969, Cyril Smith was investigated by Lancashire police over allegations that he'd sexually abused teenage boys at the Cambridge House hostel. On the 24th of January, he'd asked the police officers who were investigating for a quick decision on whether he'd be charged, because he knew he might have to be the PPC for the Liberal Party. And then what actually happened was a few, slightly longer than that later, slightly more than 3 weeks later, which is the time period he'd said, the DPP advised he shouldn't be prosecuted, no further action would be taken, and he was informed of that. And then he went to stand in 1970. So that gives us the question, obviously, what was known in those early months of 1970? Can we have a look again at what Mr. Steed says? So if we could turn to page 6 of his statement. Thank you. And zoom in at the top of that. So Mr. Steed explains he was in the area. He moved to South Manchester and he got involved in the politics in the Manchester region and became familiar with what he describes as the towering personality and media impact of Cyril Smith. If we can just then go down a couple of paragraphs. Thank you. Select those two, yes. He says he became involved with the local Liberals, especially the Manchester Region Young Liberal Organisation, and the senior party in Manchester City, Greater Manchester and North West Region levels. Visited Rochdale in '66, and it was a prime Liberal target because Ludovic Kennedy, I think, had come quite close to winning the seat.
He had.
And he met Garth and Joe Pratt, who he describes as hard-working and trying to sort of get involved in Rochdale. He describes the unusual politics of the town. Do you know what he means by that?
Very tribal, very hard.
Right. So what we've referred to already,
Yes.
of the hatred between
Yes.
Labour and Liberals. Yeah. And Garth Pratt obviously was hoping to be the PPC in 1970 in Rochdale. He then says, at the second paragraph there, he had moved away and he slightly lost touch with the Manchester area, but then Cyril Smith suddenly and controversially became Liberal PPC for Rochdale, displacing his friend Garth. And he says, he qualifies what he's about to say by saying this is one-sided. It's from sort of his Garth supporters. But if we go on and see what he says... He says, I don't know how the deposition of Garth Pratt as PPC and his replacement by Smith was affected. It was strongly resented by many, not just Garth's friends. Filtered through nearly 60 years of memory, I recall the grounds as threefold. First, Many candidates or would-be candidates thought it was scandalous that a talented candidate who's decided on his home and job to nurse a constituency for several years be summarily sacked. That would deter others from giving that commitment. That seems quite a reasonable point to make. Secondly, many on the young Liberal network, or the radical wing of the party, thought Cyril Smith too right-wing, especially his known views on capital and corporal punishment. What's that a reference to?
Cyril was quite blatant about his support for capital punishment and corporal punishment. I think. Can I comment on this paragraph?
Of course, please do. Well, I could just note the third one as well, because in some ways this is the most interesting. Many in the Northwest resented a coup they thought had been staged centrally. It was widely believed that Jeremy Thorpe, notorious for bypassing the Liberal Party's rulebook when he wanted something, had fixed it. Please do comment. What do you think of those explanations?
I find that extraordinary that Jeremy would have done that. Even if Jeremy had come across Cyril, what we know from later on, I think the phrase has been used, they cordially loathed each other. I mean, they really did not get on. Thorpe and Smith. So if they had met before, and I don't know if they did, if there's any evidence at all, then Thorpe would certainly not have supported it. Would Thorpe have supported somebody saying, we have Cyril Smith has come back into the fold, we've got a much better chance of winning Rochdale with him than we have with this young Liberal who's come in, he's moved in, but he's not known, he's not perceived to be part of the town? It wouldn't have been particularly Jeremy's role to deal with that. I mean, that would have been much more about the region, the Northwest region, saying, actually, we need to think about that. I don't think that's what happened here, because this I've seen in lots of places where the local association know, particularly for Liberals, where we don't have many MPs, and I think we had about the same as we do now at this stage, actually a local candidate, well-known, well-liked for whatever he did, Cyril was liked in the town, would have a much better chance of success than a young person. And you have to select a candidate for each general election. So Garth knew that there would be a selection process coming up, and it is, I'm afraid, not unlikely that people would have said locally, we really need Cyril, he can actually make this happen for us.
So you think it's more likely that just the local party, sad to say, just said to Garth Pratt, no, we want Cyril, rather than that Thorpe got involved?
Yeah.
Do you think that's true, even though in 1970, as you've alluded to, the Liberals were at quite a low ebb, and there might have been real pressure on Thorpe to try and get a win, and that therefore Smith was worth pushing for?
Leaders did not get involved in this. The leader of the Liberal Party at that point was almost entirely focused on the Commons rather than, and the politics of the Commons, rather than the workings of the party. Very few MPs having to cover 3 or 4 different areas of policy, as well as the general leadership too. That was left to others, including the president of the day, and also to the people like Ted Wheeler, who was our chief agent. Now we'd call him Director of Elections.
And Baroness Brinton, if I may just push you on that you've given a very clear view on it. What's that based on? Because obviously, as you've explained, you weren't involved in the national politics or in this region at that time at all. Is this from speaking to everyone else? Tell us where you got it from.
It's from my memories of the 70s in London, but it's also my experience over succeeding years as we've had very bright, very able young candidates who, when we've got to key elections, have discovered that they've been displaced by a well-known local councillor. And completely understandable, these were young Liberals. They, at the time, were seen as the future of the party. They very clear view they took on anti-apartheid. They were beginning to change things nationally. And of course they would have wanted their candidate to remain. But I'm afraid the machinations of what went on locally were quite likely to mean that Cyril was deemed to be a safer pair of hands. And it would have been very bruising for Garth and his friends. Very bruising.
Thank you. All right. A further bit of the picture is potentially filled out by Michael Meadowcroft. So if we can go back to your statement, LDP 000018, and page 6. Sorry, beg your pardon, page 7. and paragraph 5.13. Now, we have actually obtained a statement from Mr. Meadowcroft, and Chair, I'd invite you to adduce those statements in full. They're at INQ 003803, INQ 003870, and INQ 003871. There's no need to bring them up, because very helpfully Baroness Brinton has summarised what he says here. And let's just look at that, if we may, Baroness Brinton. Mr. Meadowcroft says that whilst at the time he didn't know what went on in Rochdale, following the Channel 4 dispatches programme in September 2013, when Cyril Smith allegations were put out and discussed in that programme, he had contact made with him by Jill Pratt, who was the widow of Garth Pratt. And she told him this, that Ted Wheeler, who, as you've explained, was the chief agent, that's a National Party.
It's the equivalent of a director of elections these days.
Had come up to Rochdale after Garth Pratt had been deselected, and that's interesting. So this is after the decision's been made, and asked about rumours about Cyril Smith's activities. Now, those activities, I think, are the same allegations that were made in the 1969-70 police investigation and in the RAP article that we'll come to in 1979. So allegations of sexual abuse of boys at Cambridge House. And the Pratts gave him the names and addresses of a number of people they said he ought to visit, including a Baptist minister. Do you have any idea who that was?
No. I'm afraid we believe Ted Wheeler is dead. So
there's been no chance
to find that out.
All right. And Mr. Meadowcroft advised he passed that information on to Greater Manchester Police in 2013, which we know he did. But as you say, there's no way we can find out more because Ted Wheeler is dead.
We believe he's dead. We just can't track him. We've tried. Yeah.
And unfortunately, Jill Pratt has passed away as well, as I understand it.
Yeah.
Was there any suggestion, either from Mr. Meadowcroft or from anyone else you've spoken to, that Garth Pratt passed on this information to anyone else at that time?
Not that we can find. We know Ted Wheeler went up there because there's a report in the National Exec minutes, which is in the papers here. The logical reason for Ted going to Rochdale at this time was because Cyril had been selected and the local association and possibly the region would have said, we think we can win this. So he was going up to scout round to see whether the organisational structure could deliver a win. Because a lot of local parties would like to believe that they could win, but if you don't have the full support, you're not going to be able to deliver leaflets, you're not going to be able to canvass and get the data that you need to be able to get your vote out. So that's why Ted would have gone. And from the evidence that we've received, we believe Ted was, and including from Michael, from what Jill Pratt said, that he did hear of some rumours and that he said, go to the police.
And it seems that Ted Wheeler knew about those rumours before he spoke to the Pratts, according to Michael Meadowcroft's evidence anyway, because it says Ted Wheeler asked the Pratts about it.
I would suspect that to be the case, but I can't confirm that. No. But if Ted said that, it logically, absolutely logically, he had heard it from somebody else in Rochdale.
But we haven't been able to figure out who. No. All right. So just to conclude this then, it seems we haven't been able to find anyone who can give a definitive answer about who made the decision Cyril Smith would be the PPC rather than Garth Pratt in 1970.
Correct.
Nor can we find out how Ted Wheeler knew about those allegations and when he found out about them.
Correct.
Now, Smith then, of course, did stand in the 1970 election. He lost, but he increased the vote.
Yes.
And one point that's interesting is if we could have a look at tab 22, and that's INQ 003959. We have here one of Cyril Smith's election leaflets from that election. Two things to note. Firstly, as you yourself mentioned, Baroness Brinton, it's all about him, isn't it?
Yes.
Rather than about the Liberal Party.
Yes.
But secondly, if we go over the page, and we zoom in on the paragraph beginning, I am of working class background, 4 paragraphs down.
Yep.
Cyril Smith made quite a big deal, even in his election leaflets, about the fact he'd done lots of work with young people and children, it appears. And the Labour Party, who were obviously the incumbent MP at that point, and the main opposition to the Liberals, don't seem to have made any mention of these allegations in this election campaign, do they?
No.
Is there any explanation for that?
No, I have no idea why they didn't do it.
That's fine.
I can't,
we'll
can't say.
All right. Can we now then look at the allegations of involvement in child abuse that have been made against Cyril Smith from that point on, so in the 70s? So the first period I want to look at is the 1972 by-election, when Cyril Smith got elected. And if we could go back to your statement, LDP 000018 and page 8. Now, you described the 1972 by-election here at paragraph 5.18.
Yes.
Jack McCann, who was the Labour MP, died in 1972. There was a by-election, and you'd say it was considered obvious that Smith was the only viable candidate for the Liberals.
Yes.
So he stood, and this is useful information. You managed to contact John Spiller, who was the election agent for Cyril Smith in that campaign. Now, Mr. Spiller told you that early on in the by-election campaign, the editor of the Rochdale Alternative Press contacted him and made allegations about Cyril Smith along the lines of what emerged later. Later meaning in 1979, is that right?
Yeah.
Mr. Spiller considered this was a wild allegation of the sort not uncommon in by-elections in those days, particularly when the candidate defected. He reported as he told the editor if there was any evidence he should go to the police. He never heard any more, thought no more about it. In the years that followed, he never heard any repeat of that sort of allegation, and during his tenure as General Secretary for 18 months, nothing relating to it ever crossed his desk. He basically forgot about it until the last few years. And that, again, does seem to be backed up by the contemporaneous documents.
Yep.
So if we have a look at tab 24, and that's INQ 003960. We have Mr. Spiller's summary of the campaign from 1972. And there's a lot of administrative information on the first page, but if we go to page 2, and under the heading Summary, there's mention made of the difficulties in the organisation. There's difficulties in training of workers and activists. He goes on to talk about, again, more administrative and organisational features. But there's no mention at all of any rumours or allegations against Smith, any smears in the press, anything by the Labour Party.
Correct.
Thank you.
Would it be helpful if I just say that it is not unusual in hard-fought elections and by-elections for allegations to be made against candidates? It happened to me, where I was reported to Special Branch by the candidate of one of the other parties for falsifying my nomination papers. They then did a press release about it. Special Branch had to get involved because they investigate electoral offences, and they told the other party to can it, to just stop it. And I'm afraid, you know, that happens to be my personal anecdote, but people from all parties involved in by-elections like this will see that. So the right thing for John Spiller to do at this stage was to say, go to the police. That's absolutely the right thing to do. And without any other evidence, he would have regarded it as part of the dirty tricks that were going on.
Thank you. Can we look at what happened then after the 1972 election? And you deal with this back in your statement, page 9 and paragraph 5.19. And you've spoken to 3 different individuals who have some recollection of hearing allegations about Cyril Smith following the 1972 election. So the first is Philip Goldenberg, and he remembers some allegations, although he can't remember specifically what they were about, in the mid-1970s when Cyril Smith was Chief Whip. Have you been able to find out anything else about what those might be?
I'm sorry, we have not. I mean, the problem is this is
Of course.
memory of gossip at the time rather than anything more concrete. But
Right. Did anybody mention Cyril Smith's name in connection to a man called Andre Thorne?
not to my knowledge, it hasn't. Not the reports that have come back to us.
That's never come up.
That's never come up.
All right, thank you. Secondly, you've spoken to Lord Steele, and we're going to hear from him this afternoon
Indeed.
directly. He says the only allegations he was aware of were those that emerged in 1979. And then thirdly and finally, paragraph 5.19.3, you spoke to Gordon Lishman, and we've seen his name in some of the documents.
Yes.
His recollection was that in passing in 1983, he was told that Cyril Smith had received an informal warning about his activity from the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. He says his informant was responsible for liaison between the security service and the civil powers, and in a lunchtime conversation he mentioned a different trial and the surprise that the case had been brought in such evidence, and was told in such cases it might be the only way of stopping activity even if someone was found not guilty. And they mentioned that Cyril Smith had had such a warning, and he thinks the word spanking was mentioned in the background. Mr. Lishman says if he had any reason to believe the case was more serious or continuing, he'd have said something to the Chief Whip. But he appears to have thought there's nothing much to this.
No, indeed.
And that is the sum total of what you've managed to find.
Yes.
In terms of rumours, allegations, things people being aware of.
Yes.
In that period. Can I just ask you one more general question? You and your colleagues in the party have obviously done quite a lot of digging to see if there were any allegations or rumours about child abuse.
Yes.
Was there any knowledge or rumours that people were aware of about Cyril Smith's sexuality generally, and in particular whether he was in any way involved in the homosexual vice scene?
Not to our knowledge.
All right, thank you. Now, you then have referred in your statement to the other major thing which was going on at this period, which is the Jeremy Thorpe scandal. And that dovetails neatly with the 1979 publication of the allegations about Cyril Smith.
Indeed. Yes.
In the Rochdale Alternative Press. So let's look at those together. If we just go back a few paragraphs to paragraph 5.14. And that's on page 8 of your statement. Thank you. The Thorpe scandal obviously took up huge amounts of time during the 1970s. But the impression you've got from everyone you've spoken to is that there's no memory of allegations about Cyril Smith in that period prior to 1979.
Not that we've managed to receive from anybody, no.
And that's despite the fact that Cyril Smith, as you've already alluded to, wasn't universally liked. There's also been several people who've said if there were such allegations, they think it's likely they would have emerged either via the Rochdale Alternative Press or other channels before 1979, and they've expressed some surprise about that.
They have.
Now, I want to ask you about the 1979 article. There was a splash in both the Rochdale Alternative Press, and then it was picked up by Private Eye, but not by any other papers, national papers or regional papers at the time, it appears. From those you spoke to at the time, were they surprised about that? Were they surprised that it didn't make more of an impact, that it just disappeared?
I think if it had been covered by national papers or even more mainstream papers than the Rochdale Alternative paper, then it probably would have gained more traction. But it certainly didn't, and Private Eye was well known for making statements and frequently sued by other people as well. So I think on its own it was probably not enough to trigger alarm bells.
Is it possible that the party would have taken any action to try and suppress the story, to try and stop it going to the national media?
I doubt it, because of the Jeremy Thorpe case, where clearly suppressing Jeremy trying to suppress things have been part of the story. I mean, this is my speculation. I can't confirm this, but I would have thought the party would absolutely not have wanted to do that, because it knew the party's reputation was also on the line following the Jeremy Thorpe scandal.
Can I take you briefly then to a witness statement that we've got from Dominic Carman? And you'll find that at tab 18. And the trial director is INQ 004013. Dominic Carman is the son of the late George Carman QC, who was Jeremy Thorpe's defence barrister at his trial in May, June 1979. And if we could look at page 3 of his statement, he describes this, paragraph 10, 10 to 12, if we could bring up. Thank you. He says, Cyril Smith's name didn't feature in any material way in the prosecution evidence, and although a Liberal Party colleague of Thorpe, he was not a personal friend. We've already... That's understatement.
That is an understatement.
But then Smith's name came up shortly before the trial as a result of the Rochdale Alternative Press story. Further reproduction of the allegations in Private Eye concerned George Carman greatly. It wasn't the first time he'd become aware of the alleged abuse of boys by Smith. He'd known about it for some years. Just pausing there. That's interesting, isn't it? Because
it is, but I've no idea where he got that from.
And then he says there was a real concern because it was potentially prejudicial for his client, for Jeremy Thorpe. It concerned another prominent Liberal MP, probably the best-known public figure apart from Thorpe and David Steele. And so he's very concerned of the impact on the trial. And then this, paragraph 12. My father was annoyed, anxious and determined to shut the story down. Professionally, he couldn't take any direct action himself, but I believe that solicitors, not Kingsley Napley, who had retained my father to defend Thorpe, were used to prevent further publication. I don't know which firm. Lord Goodman may have been involved, I can't be certain. And from my father's perspective, the outcome was successful. The Smith story disappeared and wasn't resurrected until 2010. Do you have any comment on that?
All I would say is that we've searched through all the archives to see if there is any correspondence with solicitors, and there isn't.
There's nothing.
I have a suspicion that Smith might have employed his own solicitors, but we can find no evidence
So the party didn't...
to say that the party employed solicitors to do that.
All right. Thank you. Finally then, the response to the 1970 article and the RAP article and Private Eye article does seem to have generally been they weren't believed or they weren't taken any further. And there's only one reference we can find in any Liberal Party document from the time which may refer to this. And I just want to bring this up to see if you can help us with it. It's INQ 003954. And Chair, this isn't in your bundle. This is, excuse me, an additional document. But there's just one page we want to look at. And this is the minutes, again, of the National Executive Committee. This is just after the election in 1979. And if we turn over the page to page 2, there's a discussion about how the election went generally. And if we could just go to the bottom of the page, beginning at the paragraph Claire Brooks. Thank you. Could you tell us who Claire Brooks was, or is?
She died in 2008, I think. She was an absolute stalwart activist of the Liberal Party, extremely influential, was not afraid to express her displeasure with the establishment of the party, famously had a sit-down strike when she discovered that female staff at a conference were being paid less than male staff, and all the members refused to go to the break until that was resolved. So she was
strong woman,
very strong woman, and somebody who I, as a very young and minor Liberal, admired. She was a role model for Liberals in a world that was dominated by men in politics. She was somebody who was not afraid to speak her mind.
We see her expressing her mind here. She says she expressed her extreme disquiet at the unfair tactics used by opponents of the Liberal Party. There had been one particularly damaging article in a northern regional newspaper, and any other notable instances of unethical behaviour demonstrated by the major parties. You probably can't help us with this, Baroness Brinton, but has anyone been able to find out whether that is a reference to Cyril Smith?
I'm afraid I've only seen this morning. We haven't found anything to suggest that. I think the only other thing that I would say about Rochdale, which does appear elsewhere, is about the tactics of the far right in Rochdale, which I know that we as a party had been extremely concerned about, was one of our major themes at the time in the 70s, was fighting racism, and particularly following Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood speech. It could be that, but it could be something else, but there's nothing more specific, unfortunately.
Thank you. Finally then, under sort of allegations about Cyril Smith, can we come to any allegations there were from the 1980s onwards? And if we come back to your statement and page page 10. Thank you. 5.2. You describe here two people you've spoken to in particular who recall discussions or hearing things about Cyril Smith in the 1980s, early 90s. The first is Liz Lynn. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, she was the MP after Cyril Smith. Is that right?
Yes.
Was she a friend of his?
Absolutely not.
Just tell us a little bit about that.
Cyril did everything he could to undermine her campaign, and really only started talking to her after she was elected MP. Liz was one of the contestants for president, so I didn't talk to her at all when the revelations came out, because obviously we were competing in an election.
Right. This
is obviously since I've become president.
And the second person is Chris Davies,
yes,
who was a colleague of Liz Lynn's at the time.
Correct.
And you've summarised what he said in your statement, but I think it might be helpful to see it in full. So if you go to his recollections, they're at tab 6, Chair, of your bundles. And for the trial director, it's LDP 000012. And if we could go down to the last 3 paragraphs exactly, I think around 1985. Mr. Davis says this: I think around 1985, someone showed me a copy of the Rochdale Free Press, that's probably the Rochdale Alternative Press, article from 1979 that alleged he had spanked boys in care, or maybe I was just told about it. But it was old news spread by political opponents and referred to a time before Cyril became an MP. Indeed, I think he was a Labour Party councillor at the time. I think that is actually right. He wasn't a Labour Party councillor, he was an independent councillor in 1967, I think. Right?
Yes. Yes, I think he
was a Labour Party councillor and then an independent.
And then independent.
It wasn't an issue that ever came up on the doorstep or in the Rochdale Observer. He then says, during my 29 years as a Lib and Liberal Democrat candidate, I never received any communication of any type alleging inappropriate behaviour by Cyril. I don't recall any complaints. I spoke at his memorial service. I wouldn't have done so if I believed he'd carried out the acts that have been alleged. Remain unconvinced, it can well be correct, but that's maybe because I believe he was a far better representative than those who followed him. And then if we can go over the page, and can we zoom in on the two paragraphs beginning, incidentally, and I remember. He's asked about whether there could be any cover-up or collusion, and you've referred to this already, Baroness Brinton. He says Labour and the Lib Dems hated each other, so he doesn't think that's likely. But he then says he remembers getting a call, I think when Nick Clegg was leader, from someone in his office or in Cowley Street. What's Cowley Street?
Cowley Street was the Liberal Democrat headquarters at the time.
Who'd been asked to find out if anyone had complained about Cyril to me. Do you know when that was? Would that be after 2010?
No, it could have been before 2010. Nick Clegg became leader in 2008 and ceased to be leader in 2015. So I'm afraid we can't date it exactly because Chris doesn't say, but it is just possible it was before then.
I told him as above. I said I'd also discussed the claims with Liz Lynn, who told me she too had never had any allegations made to her. She pondered whether she could have forgotten, and I told her, knowing her, she couldn't possibly have done so. All her political antennae would have been quivering. She would certainly have covered her back by forwarding the allegations to police, and if she'd found substance in them, would have gone for the jugular and attacked Cyril publicly. Do you think that's likely? Did they hate each other that much?
Oh, they did hate each other. I mean, I think when your predecessor does everything they can to undermine your own election, absolutely.
Right, thank you. So that is Mr. Davis' recollection. And the final piece of recollection, as I said, we come back one last time to Mr. Steed. Mm-hmm. And he gives his view of what he heard in the 70s and 80s. We could go back to Mr. Steed's statement, LDP 000011, and page 6, it's tab 5 again, Baroness Brinton. You have it. And page 6 of this. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Let's go next page, page 7. And the last three paragraphs beginning from 1980 onwards. So Mr. Steed describes his interactions with Cyril Smith in the 70s and then says, actually, from 1980 onwards, our paths crossed much less. After I fell seriously ill in 1985, hardly saw him again. Moved back to Kent in 1989. Said, I thought I knew Cyril fairly well in the 1970s. Came to like him, thought he was a kind man as well as politically shrewd and strongly committed to his hometown and the Liberal cause. Somewhat oversensitive, some found him disagreeable. And then, next paragraph down, so as a middle-aged bachelor living at home with his mother, Cyril Smith was an obvious subject for gossip about his sexual orientation. I moved in gay circles. The topic of public figures who hid or suppressed their homosexuality was often discussed. It became known that I knew Cyril fairly well. I was asked many times about his sexuality. I never had anything real to say and answer. The general assumption in such conversations seems to have been he was asexual, perhaps even impotent, as a result of the hormonal problems which caused his massive size. I can't recall anyone in my hearing ever offering any evidence as to his erotic or sexual inclinations or behaviour. And then if we could turn over the page, and the second paragraph there, beginning in 1979. In 1979, I became aware of the story about him smacking boys that appeared in Private Eye. I can't remember whether it was quoted to me over the phone or if I was shown a copy, perhaps each in that order. I don't know if I possessed a copy or read it carefully until Tony Grieve sent me a copy after Cyril's death. My reaction has to be seen in the context of the time. The Private Eye story was certainly not to Cyril's credit, any more than the stories one heard in those days of how Tory cabinet ministers had caned small boys when they were school prefects. I myself gone through a school system where caning was routine and experienced a headmaster who clearly enjoyed caning boys on a casual whim. Private Eye story was politically embarrassing, just like Cyril's known views on corporal punishment, but not as potentially embarrassing as what he might do when capital punishment came before the 1917 Parliament. And that does seem to be the general feeling from the people at the time that we have.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Can we then, I think this is the second last thing to ask you about, look at the Liberal Democrat response to the allegations about Smith as they then came out in 2012 and 2013-14. So Cyril Smith died in, he retired firstly in 1992.
Correct.
He was still seen as a positive figure for the Liberals, by and large, I think, in that period. That seems to be the case, at least, from the fact that Sir Nick Clegg, when he was leader, sent a rather generous birthday message to him for his 80th birthday. I won't ask you to turn this up, but we have it in the bundle at tab 11. So this is on the 28th of June 2008. Dear Sir Cyril, many congratulations on your 80th birthday. You have been a towering figure.
In all senses
Literally,
of the word.
not only in the political advancement of the Liberal Party, but the wider cause of liberalism. You were a beacon for our party in the 70s and 80s, continue to be an inspiration for the people of Rochdale and many others. So it seems to have been, at least publicly, celebrated.
Yes, and if I can say that the role of leader of the party is that you write a lot of these sorts of letters, telegrams in the old days to congratulate long-term activists and obviously people like Cyril. I mean, knowing Nick Clegg, he would never have sent that if he had any inkling of what Cyril had been up to. He absolutely would not.
And the first point when the allegations start to come into the public domain is almost immediately after Cyril Smith died in 2010. They then really started to get attention in late 2012, as I understand it, when Simon Dunchuk MP made allegations in Parliament. Is that right?
I believe so.
And it was at that point that an internal investigation was carried out by the party. Can you tell us a little bit about that? So I think it was Alistair Carmichael,
who was then
Chief Whip at that
Chief
point?
Whip, but he was also Deputy Chief Whip to the government because it was during the coalition.
And what did he do?
He went to speak to everybody who had known Cyril in Parliament, who had been a contemporary of his, who was still alive, whether they were either in the Commons or the Lords or no longer in Parliament but available to speak to find out if anybody knew anything at all.
And what did he find out?
There was nothing. The Chief of Staff went through the archives to see if any of the previous Chief Whips and Chiefs of Staff had anything on record. There was absolutely nothing. I mean, this included going to the LSC, the National Liberal Club. I think we later say we've found some more archives at Bristol, and we went through those as well. But they've been very, very clear that there was nothing.
And did Mr. Carmichael produce any kind of report on this, or was it simply a piece of work that was done and then
he was
orally
reporting
reported?
back to Nick Clegg, and I presume to the President of the day, because you would automatically have had the President of the day included in that.
Who was that at the time?
I think Tim
Tim
Farron
Farron
had just taken over at that point. Yeah.
So that was the conclusion at that stage. And in response to the inquiry's questions to the party, I understand further searches have been done.
Indeed.
Again, nothing else found.
No.
All right, thank you. Can I then just finally come to the issue of any other Liberal Party or Liberal Democrat members about whom allegations of child abuse have been made, in particular those who have been convicted of child abuse, and how that's been dealt with. And then we'll finally look at your current disciplinary and safeguarding policies. In your statement, you deal with this at paragraph 8, and that's on page 12. So back in tab 1, Chair, and it's LDP 000018, and page 12. And right at the bottom there, this is any other allegations, paragraph 8, and if we turn over the page, we'll see you've done a fairly thorough trawl of any other prominent members of the party
Yes.
who have had convictions of any kind relating to this kind of offences. Can I ask you, if you just look at paragraph 8.4,
Yes.
there's one name in particular there which I think you might be able to tell us a little bit more detail about.
Yes.
And that's the first one, Frank Beck.
Indeed, I can.
Just very briefly, how was that dealt with, and how do you know about it?
I don't know how it was dealt with at the time, because in 1991 I wasn't even a councillor. But at the time, the normal procedure then would have been, if a member had been charged of such a serious offence, then they would have been suspended and expelled as soon as the court case was concluded. In other words, the party waited for the court to proceed. I think earlier on someone said you're innocent until proven guilty.
Yes.
So the party would always follow a higher authority in making a judgment about a member. I mean, it particularly caught my eye because I became a county councillor in 1993 at Cambridgeshire, and Frank Beck had had some association with some of the council staff in Cambridgeshire, although most of his offences were in Leicestershire and in Hertfordshire. And in my role as I became co-chair of the Education Committee, and therefore I had member responsibility for safeguarding. And I can remember discussions with my Director of Education at the time about what safeguarding procedures we had with our schools. And then I think it is very noticeable that during the 4 years I had as Chair of Education, our approach to any reports of any behaviour was completely different. And I think, so I would then say, looking at the parallel with the party, as cases like this started to come out, then the party also started to rethink its approach, rather than just saying you must go to the police, you must deal with the police.
And let's just look at that. Chair, I'm just noticing the time. I've only got about 5 minutes more, so I think I'd invite you just to finish Baroness Brinton's evidence. Thank you. Can we look at an example that you refer to in your statement? And that is the more recent example at paragraph 8.6 of Jason
Zadrozny.
And just talk us through, this seems to be an example of what you're describing, a very different approach to when allegations are made.
Indeed, I would go further than that and say we now have a completely different approach to safeguarding on matters like this. Although I have no formal role as president in the discipline process itself, because I line manage the pastoral care officer, she and I will have discussions to make sure that if there's any issues about safeguarding support for complainants, the point at which we need to go to the police or to other agencies, we will do so sooner rather than later, unless we're absolutely confident that they have been involved. And in this particular case, the initial response when he was arrested was that he and many of his supporters believed that a lot of this was political opponents trying to get at him. Nonetheless, the allegations were so serious that we took the view he could not continue as the candidate in the election, and he was pulled out as that election began. And then we had actually removed him because it was so long. And this is one of the other problems we have when cases go to the police, that members can sit in a suspended limbo for years, and the party has to wait until that process is concluded. But he was subsequently found not guilty. He has not rejoined the party as far as I know, but that process was very clear, and we moved extremely fast because it was very serious.
Thank you.
Could I just point out the second example on 8.7 as well?
Yes.
Because this one, I think, also demonstrates what the party does now, where we had somebody who had been a candidate. We were very concerned about their behaviour. We had reported them to the police, and because there was grooming involved, both of young party members but also non-party members, we reported it to social services. Immediately, because we absolutely believe we had a duty to do so. He was expelled for inappropriate behaviour, which we could do, but we had to leave the other matter to the authorities.
Yes. Can I come then finally to, you've provided a second witness statement to the inquiry dealing with all this in a lot more detail. It's tab 2 of your bundle, and for the trial director it's LDP 000019. And again, Chair, I'd invite you to adduce this in full, and indeed the 7 policies which were attached to it. But there are really just 2 things I want to pick up on this in oral evidence, Baroness Brinton. The first is at paragraph 10, and that's on page 3. Thank you. And you've referred to this already, but in 2013 the party created a post called Pastoral Care Officer. Can you just tell us what that is?
She is there to provide support for complainants and also for support for staff as well. So she has an employment role as well for any staff who have issues about grievance, discipline, or any incidents that may come up. She is the first point of contact, whether it's via the web or the phone, if a complainant has particularly a serious incident that might relate to something that could be a crime or could be sexual harassment, could be bullying. And she will help the complainant through that process. And if they are the direct victim of that, because some complaints are raised by others who've witnessed things, then she will actually make sure that she guides them through. But she is not part of the discipline process. That's important. I line manage her.
And was this system created, even in part, in response to the Cyril Smith allegations that all emerged in 2012, or was it a process happening anyway?
It was beginning to happen anyway. I would suggest that it was partly Cyril Smith. It was also partly because of the Helena Morrissey review into our discipline processes about sexual harassment that we needed to take steps.
Thank you. And then the final point from this, Baroness Brinton, is at paragraph 14, where you describe how there's been some further updates. Lord Ken MacDonald, the former DPP, was asked to review the disciplinary processes in 2017.
Yes.
And you say at the end of that paragraph, the constitutional changes were going to go to the party conference and be implemented later in 2018. We're now in 2019. Has that happened?
They actually went to the autumn conference, and we are now recruiting the new adjudicators, investigators and mediators who are being trained, and the process is going to be started at the beginning of July this year, but we're well underway with it.
Thank you.
Could I add one other thing on the policies, if I may?
Yes, of course.
We are very aware that it's helpful for a particular group of elected people to create policies. But what happens after those people move on, and we're about to have our next set of federal elections for the next 3 years. As part of our policies, the incoming federal board will have to review each of these policies and also to be aware, and we now provide safeguarding training for senior officers in the party at conference and at regional conferences to make sure that people have got the training that they need to be able to be aware and deliver this.
So they actually implement it. It's not
so
just a piece of paper.
actually implement it, yes.
Sorry, excuse me. And just for completeness, you don't need to trouble you with this, Baroness Brinton, but just the policies I think are all online anyway.
They are.
We're going to formally adduce them as part of the inquiry process. They are LDP 000020 through to LDP 000026 inclusive, and I'd invite you to adduce those as well, Chair. Thank you, Baroness Brinton, very much. I think we'll take the break now. I'm afraid I need to ask you not to leave the building quite yet, because there may be some further questions. There may be some questions from the Chair and panel now, or we can take a break. It's in your hands, Chair.
Just one question, Baroness Brinton. In relation to the latter questions there, have you considered or had anyone carry out an independent audit of how you've handled both the responses to allegations and your own policies and procedures on it?
Only via, not independent, but Ken MacDonald, who's a party member, did it for us, but we believed, with his experience, was independent enough and didn't hold office within the party. But we've not gone outside.
And at any time was anyone commissioned to look at the handling of the Smith allegations?
No.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. We'll take a break now.
Thank you, Chair. There are just 2 further questions for Baroness Brinton from a core participant. Baroness Brinton, there's just, as you've heard, 2 further questions I've been invited to ask you. You'll recall we discussed the change in the way that disciplinary procedures are carried out. And if we could have a look at your statement again at paragraph 8.3. Just for the trial director, it's LDP 000018 and at page 13. And paragraph 8.3, you say this: it is now standard practice to suspend members when serious allegations are made and or members are reported to the police. When you say now in that sentence, when has that been standard practice from?
Over the last 3 to 4 years. Since the Helena Morrissey report and Ken MacDonald started his review, we implemented it before we implemented the new discipline processes, because that was something we could do without changing our constitution.
Thank you. And finally, are you aware of any other allegations of child sexual abuse that have been made against Liberal Democrat MPs since Cyril Smith?
MPs, no. I think we've listed everybody that we were aware of. Or you mean allegations
Allegations
as opposed
to convictions?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Thank you very much. Chair, I invite you just to take a very quick break.
Yes, we'll take 5 minutes in order to transfer the witnesses. Thank you. Please sit.
Chair, our next witness is Des Wilson.
Repeat the words after me. Thank you. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
nothing
the
but
truth.
the truth.
Thank you.
Could you give your full name, please?
Des Wilson.
Mr. Wilson, you were born and grew up in New Zealand. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And you came to this country in 1960 when you were about 19 years old.
Yes.
And I think it's right to say that when you arrived in this country and for a few years afterwards, you had no involvement in party politics at all.
None.
What did you do for those few years after you arrived in this country?
Well, I left school at 15, so that's the only education I ever had. And I became a reporter on the local paper, and my whole career subsequently was in journalism. So in those first few years, I was working on unimportant newspapers.
Do you mean the first few years after you arrived in this country?
After I arrived in this country.
Unimportant newspapers for a time, but I think subsequently you started writing for The Observer and The Guardian.
Well, that came later. I had a period when I got involved in fighting various causes, which got me some national prominence, and that led to me getting my own column in The Guardian and The Observer. And I had a column in either of those papers for a period of about 7.5 years.
Now, you mentioned being involved in causes. One of them was the homelessness charity Shelter.
Yes, I was one of the founders.
And that was still in the 70s, was it, or the 60s?
No, it was launched on December the 1st, 1966, and I was the first director and was with them until 1971.
That must have taken up much of your time during that period.
About 24 hours a day.
In any event, there came a time during the 1970s that you did become involved in party politics.
I became involved in party politics because I was telephoned by David Steele, who I knew well, and told that there was a by-election coming up in Hove, and would I fight it for the Liberal Party? And I said, well, that's a bit difficult because I'm not a member of the Liberal Party. And he said, well, that could be sorted. I also thought it was a bad choice because I had a fairly radical image, and Hove was the 8th safest Conservative seat in the country. My third problem was that I didn't want to be an MP, and he assured me that I wouldn't be because it was unwinnable. So on that basis, I joined the Liberal Party and fought that by-election.
And that was in 1973, you told us?
November 73.
I'm going to take you through your political career in the next few minutes, and one of the things you say in your witness statement is that it wasn't a seamless career. There were various episodes in your life when you were heavily involved in party politics, and then other times when you had very little involvement. And this was the first of those times, was it?
Yes, I mean, I should explain. The reason why I appeared to dip in and out was that I was occasionally running fairly major, high-profile campaigns that involved winning over the two major parties. And I had to step back from a party political profile in order to be able to be effective in doing that.
In any event, this was the first of those episodes. Yeah. You've explained how you were invited by David Steele to stand in the Hove by-election. I think it's right to say, isn't it, that you had also been invited even earlier than that to get involved with the Labour Party?
I had been, but I chose not to.
But you did accept Mr. Steele's offer in 1973.
If you can call it an offer, I certainly agreed to do it.
And tell us what happened at that by-election.
Well, we did extremely well. I mean, there was a point about a week out when it looked like we might win it. I was terrified that we might actually win the thing. But in fact, it swung back in the last week and the Conservatives won. But we did get a 37% swing for the Liberals, which remains to this day one of the biggest swings in any by-election ever.
Now, you've described how you were phoned up and asked to do this job. We've heard some other evidence about how candidates at by-elections are selected, and for that matter, the slightly different process for selection of candidates at general elections, both by the Liberal Party. Tell us a little bit about the formalities, such as they were, of you being selected, appointed to run for the Liberals in that particular seat in that election.
Well, I've read the evidence about the process, and it's quite foreign to me in my time, way back then and in the 1970s. But in my case, it was almost bizarre, because I went down to a selection committee of 3 people, a Cambridge University student who left for university the next day and was never seen again, a woman who explained to me that she was about to migrate to South Africa, which she duly did that week and was never seen again, and one chap who remained to be my driver during the by-election, and that's how I was chosen. I also noted that it was said that one went through an interview process nationally. This was completely forgotten until halfway through the by-election, when someone said, maybe as a matter of courtesy, I should be interviewed. So I went up and had tea with the president of the party at that time, Lord Beaumont.
So there was an interview of sorts, even though, as you say, it was after you had already been appointed as the candidate.
Of sorts.
And what about references or anything of that nature?
No.
In fact, any other formalities other than those you've explained to us?
No, I mean, without sounding arrogant, I think they were so excited to have actually talked me into doing this that no one was going to try and rock the boat by asking for references. I might have had difficulty finding any.
All right. Well, as you've said, you fought the campaign. You didn't succeed in winning the seat, despite the very large swing. And did you then carry on your involvement in the Liberal Party for a period after that?
Yes. I'm just trying to remember the timing. I stayed involved with the party for probably about another couple of years or so.
And you refer in your witness statement to being elected a member of the party council during that period.
Yes, although the party council really was an organisation of no importance. It existed really as a kind of safety valve between the annual party conferences, just in case issues needed to be discussed or whatever. But it wasn't a big deal to get elected to the council.
But it was the national body that served that purpose you've described.
Yeah.
And you must have decided that you wanted to be a member of it. You stood for election, did you?
Yes.
And how long can you remember were you a member of the party council at that time?
Oh, not long, probably only a year or so.
Now, you mentioned in your statement that this was, if we're talking about 1973, 1974, this was in the early stages of the Thorpe affair, before the trial, obviously,
yes.
but when allegations were first starting to be made.
Yes, in fact, I was on the council when the whole thing broke, and I was at the party conference when he turned up unexpectedly. The party was hoping he'd keep away. So, yes, I was around at that time.
But then, I think you explain in your statement, there came a time when you decided to move back away from party politics. You've just said a couple of years after the election, something of that nature, so in the mid-1970s. Is that right?
Let me just check my timing.
The precise dates don't matter, probably.
Right, yes, I pulled back because I had got involved when I was doing a lot of journalism at the time, some of which would not have been helped by me being associated with a particular party. And then I came back in 1982.
Just let me ask you a little bit more about that period in the mid-70s up to 1982. Were you living in London at the time?
Not all of the time, but most of it.
Most of it. Did you still have very much to do with the Liberal Party activists and members who you'd presumably got to know in those earlier years?
You know, I had a lot of friends in the party and I continued to see them, but I wasn't actively involved. I should explain that I felt rather guilty after the Hove by-election that I'd taken an opportunity that perhaps someone who had worked for years in the party should have had the opportunity to do, and reached a higher profile than I deserved. And so that was one of the factors in persuading me that I should stand back a bit for a period of time.
I see. So just help us. You were still living in London. You were still seeing your former colleagues and friends from the Liberal Party,
yes.
But you weren't still on the council, is that right?
No.
And you didn't take an active part,
No.
for example, going to national conferences or anything
No.
of that nature. All right, so that takes us through the mid to late 70s, and I think you said a moment ago that you got back involved in the early 1980s, 1982.
1981, actually. Yeah.
1981. Well, tell us what prompted you to get back involved at that time.
It was beginning to look like there was going to be a new party. The Social Democrats were being launched, and this was suddenly opening up a whole new opportunity in British politics of a third major force that I very much believed we needed. So it was very attractive to me to get involved at that time.
I see. And how did you get back involved? You mentioned in your statement that you were reappointed to the party council.
I got involved by going to the 1981 assembly, which was the one where the famous 4 Social Democrats came to speak to the Liberals. And from then on, I started going to the assembly and getting more involved in party activities generally. And then in 1985, it was suggested that I should run for the presidency of the party, and I did, and I was elected unopposed.
So, and it's perhaps you were already a member again of the council, were you, by that time?
Probably. I can't actually remember, but I probably was.
Is the presidency, as it were, the head of the council, or what's the relationship between the role of the
president chaired
and
the council. The president
yes.
chaired. The president was the head of the party in the country. He attended, or she attended, the weekly meeting of the parliamentary party on behalf of the party in the country, and generally speaking, spoke for the party in the country. And if the MPs were, or the leader were doing something that the president believed was inconsistent with where the party was at, it would be the president's role to try and deal with that.
I see. Now, I think I'm right in saying, Mr. Wilson, that you didn't stand for election as an MP again, either during this period or at any other time.
No, I never wanted to be an MP.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, whether that was, as it were, deliberate or not. But you say you never sought to be an MP again.
Well, I achieved so much more not being an MP. I mean, I actually put, I think, 5 private members' bills through the House of Commons using an MP to do it. I don't think anyone else in British political history has done that. So with my campaigns, which led to lead-free petrol, freedom of information and various other things, I was able to achieve so much more outside the House of Commons than the MPs inside, members of a very small parliamentary group.
Well, just carrying on with the narrative, and then I'm going to come back and ask you some other questions. You've mentioned then that you were the party president, I think, between 1986 and 1987. It was just a one-year term, was it?
Yes, although it became an absolutely pivotal moment because we had a general election while I was president and fought it as an alliance, and then immediately afterwards went into the negotiations about merging. And I was a leading advocate of the merger. I wrote a book at the time that concluded by arguing the case for merger. I wrote numerous articles in The Guardian arguing the case for merger, made speeches, and eventually led the Liberal negotiating team that finally put the deal together.
So that whole period, 1986, leading up to the general election itself, when I think you were chairman of the election committee
Yep.
for the Liberal Party, that election, as you say, was fought as an alliance, and then there was a time immediately following the 87 election where the merger was discussed and in the end took place. You explain in your witness statement how you were prominent within the Liberal Party in being one of the people who drove that merger through.
Correct.
The book you mention, was that called Battle for Power?
Yes.
And was it essentially an account of the 1987 election, one of a sort of insider's account?
Yes, it was an account of my year as president, but it incorporated the election, and it concluded with making the case for the merger.
Not well received by all of your colleagues in the Liberal Party?
It was well received by everyone in the party except the Parliamentary Party, who, at their first meeting after the general election, tried to move a vote of censure on me for the publication of this book. I did point out to them that even Hitler read some of the books before he burnt them, and it might have made sense to actually read the book before they tried to move this vote of censure. This was led by Cyril Smith.
Well, let me ask you then, because this was, I mentioned at the start, you described these three periods of your involvement, the first being the 1973 by-election and a couple of years immediately after that. And then this is the second, isn't it, between the early 1980s up to about 1987.
Correct.
And as you've described it, you were a much more senior figure in the party by that stage, and you've explained your involvement in the merger and so on. And Cyril Smith was a prominent member of the party, a nationally recognised figure at that time.
Yes. I first met Cyril Smith when I fought the by-election, and he came down to Hove to speak at that, and we may come back to that later. And he was still around for certainly at the time when I was president.
Now, just finishing off the chronology, at around 1987 or thereabouts, you went back to campaigning work and so took a step back again from party politics.
Yes, once the parties had merged, I was elected onto the executive of the new party and served, I think, 1 year on it, and then went back to run a series of campaigns at that time.
And what were those campaigns?
The Campaign for Freedom of Information. I became chairman of Friends of the Earth. A campaign about children smoking called Parents Against Tobacco. I ran an organisation called Citizen Action, which was based on what Ralph Nader was doing in America, where he had like a holding company with a number of campaigns under it. And I ran an organisation called Citizen Action, which had a sitcom which was about legal reforms in the legal system, freedom of information, various environmental issues and such like.
And you've explained that because you needed to campaign to all the different political parties and try and win their support for these issues, that was inconsistent, if you like, with being particularly involved with one of the parties.
It would have been really difficult, because the problem would have been that they would have been suspicious that really what I was doing was promoting the Liberal cause and using them to do it. It just wasn't a sensible thing to do.
So, in any event, that was why you took a step back. And
Correct.
Did you, as with the previous occasions, stop or cease your membership of the various councils
Correct.
and committees and
Correct.
so on? But there was one last period when you were back involved, this time with the new Liberal Democrat Party, and that was the 1992 election.
Well, what had happened is that the new party got off to a terrible start. It was virtually bankrupt. It had to fire most of its staff. It got so low in the opinion polls. At one point it was at 3%, which is the equivalent of within a margin of error of having no support at all. It got thrashed by the Greens in European elections, and it was in desperate straits. And with its first general election coming up, it came to me almost on its knees. It said, could I bring my campaigning experience in to run the general election campaign? And I agreed to do it.
You did it, and did you stay involved in the party after the election, or was it simply a short period of time?
No, that was my that was my last throw of the dice.
And so you ceased your involvement with the party after that election?
Yes.
Right. Well, look, let me come back and ask you a few more general questions, Mr. Wilson. You've mentioned briefly in the context of the reception of that book you wrote, Battle for Power, about the 1987 election, that the book was, I think you said, well received by members in the country, but less so by the parliamentary party. Can you give us an idea of the parliamentary party at the time and its relations with the party in the country?
It was almost like two parties. The party in the country was very strong, winning council elections. In fact, at the time I was president, I believe it got more votes in council elections than either of the major parties. It was starting to take over city councils like Liverpool, and it was driven by an organisation called the Association of Liberal Councillors. And it was very strong, very healthy, and I was very much their president. They saw me as a president of the party, rather than, I heard the Baroness earlier talking about an establishment figure. I was never seen as an establishment figure. The parliamentary party tended to consist of a considerable number of by-election winners. I mean, it's worth stressing this. I literally scribbled down this morning from the top of my head some of the by-elections we won in the time I was in the party. Eastbourne, Ely, Crosby, Eastleigh, Bermondsey, Rochdale, Sutton and Cheam, Ripon, Berwick-upon-Tweed, Glasgow, Govan, Bermondsey, Brecon and Radnor. All of these MPs were elected in by-elections, and they basically had two functions. One was to...
Mr. Wilson, I'm just going to interrupt you. Just try and, if you can, slow down a little bit, because these ladies in front of you are trying to make a transcript of what you're saying, and sometimes if you get a bit carried away, they can't follow what you're saying. So try and slow down a little.
Most unlikely for me to get carried away, but carry on.
But possibly about by-elections. Do go
on. Well, I think the point I was making was that most of them, when they weren't in Westminster, were straight back to their constituencies, fighting to hold them at the next general election. So, in a way, they lived in a world of their own that was not much related to what they called the activists. And they didn't use that word as a compliment necessarily. And this was my big problem with the parliamentary party. I believed that it was such a good campaigning party. The parliamentary party should have been the tip of the arrow, and that it should have about 6 to 8 issues that it fought on in the House of Commons, instead of trying to effectively shadow over 200 ministers and have someone at every day, at every debate. It was ludicrous. And no one knew they were there. No one knew what they said or did. Whereas if, in fact, they'd had a whole party organised behind them on a particular issue, it could have been very, very effective indeed. Now, they really, really didn't like the idea of being campaigning in MPs and actually having to do some work, and that was part of the problem.
Now, I'm going to ask you to look at a book review that you wrote, Mr. Wilson. It was a review of Simon Danczuk's book, Smile for the Camera, and I'm going to ask you to look at a few passages from that book review during the next hour or so. Can we call it up on screen, please? It's INQ 004084. It's behind tab 3 in your bundle, I think, Mr. Wilson, and for the chair and panel. And if we can just zoom in on the very bottom paragraph that we see on that page. Now, you don't mince your words in this paragraph or indeed in other parts of this article, Mr. Wilson. We see just in the last few lines of that paragraph, you describe the parliamentary party as a weakly led and self-serving parliamentary party that in the 1980s reached rock bottom in Liberal history, and coming after the Thorpe murder trial years, that's saying something. Is that what you were just describing? I mean, expand on that, if you will.
I thought that the parliamentary party was a bit of a rebel, to be honest. A lot of the MPs had come down with great ambitions and hopes that now they were in national politics, they were going to really make it, and only to find that they were sitting on the backbenches unnoticed. And they tended to spend most of their meetings arguing over who would go to what day in the House of Commons for a debate on white fish or something. when there was no need for them to be there. This is the point I was making earlier. And so there was a lot of squabbling and arguing. The policies they adopted were entirely related to the interests of each constituency. So, for instance, if an MP had a nuclear power station in his constituency, he would support nuclear power, even though it was not the policy of the party. And I used to sit there on Wednesday evenings sometimes and just think, well, thank God I'm the only one in the party who's here.
Now, you say Wednesday evenings. I think you mentioned earlier that you, as party president, attended weekly meetings of the parliamentary parties.
Yes.
Those were the Wednesday
Yes.
meetings, were they?
Yes.
Let's just have a look, if we can, at a different document. This is your witness statement. So I think it's tab 1 in your bundle. Can we go to INQ 003670? And if we can look at page 2, please. Mr. Wilson, you say you didn't think much of the parliamentary party. You suggest in this paragraph they didn't think much of you either.
Well, as I explained, there was a fundamental disagreement between them and me about their role. And they just saw me as this sort of rather, I think, nutty activist who wanted to make them actually do some work on campaigning issues. And I can remember one MP scoffing at the word campaigning. We're not here to campaign, he said.
Let's just look at paragraph 9, please, if we can zoom in on that. You say, as your memoirs show, your relations with MPs in both the old and new parties were bad, and you describe, we don't need to read it through, but you describe what you've said, really, that your popularity in the party had come from your campaigning experience and your reputation, and that wasn't something that went down well with,
yes,
with the
it's
MPs.
worth noting that every time I stood for any office in the party, I either topped the poll or was within the top 3, so I had considerable support in the party. The other thing, of course, which drove the MPs mad, particularly at that time, was that because of my national profile, I tended to get invited on radio and television and things of that sort, where they didn't, and they really resented this, thinking the party president should know his place.
Thank you. Now, let's move on, Mr. Wilson. I want to ask you a few questions about Cyril Smith. In fact, we can stick with that document, your witness statement, INQ 003670, and if we can go over to page 3 of that document, please. And can we zoom in on paragraphs 10 to 12? Now, you mentioned a few minutes ago, Mr. Wilson, that you had met Mr. Smith, Cyril Smith, during that Hove by-election. He came down to speak during the election. Is that right?
Yes.
And summarise, if you will, your memory of that occasion and your impression of Mr. Smith generally.
The first thing to say about Cyril Smith, you will have seen photographs of him, you will have seen him on television. Can't exaggerate how enormous he was. He was a huge man, and this in itself had a kind of intimidating impact, and particularly if you were arguing with him, which is one of the reasons why when the whole thing about boys came out, I was terrified for them because I could imagine what a frightening figure he was. He was enormous. The second thing was that he never disagreed in an argument on a major policy or about his position in the party without adding a threat. There was always a threat. I will leave the party, I will resign, I will go to the press, I will do this, I will do the other. And it was always, he had a view of himself as being indispensable to the party, but also he recognised the huge impact it would make if he did resign or whatever. So that he bullied the party in a way, he bullied the parliamentary party in a way by constantly making these kinds of threats.
Let's have a look at what you say about that in your witness statement. So picking it up, I think this paragraph 10 up, 5 lines down from the bottom, from the top, you say, my view of him was on the positive side, that he was a larger-than-life figure who came across well in the media and cheered up party members, but on the negative side, that this out-front personality only partially hid an ego almost as big as he was physically, that he used his popularity to blackmail the party leadership by constant threats to resign if he didn't get his way, and was generally a bullying, selfish manipulator of his public image. All of which, according to the book, and that's which book? Is that Simon Danchuk's book that you're referring to there?
Yes, I presume so, yes.
Enabled him to get away with what he did in Rochdale.
You asked about when I met him. I saw both sides of Cyril Smith the first time I met him. He was very, very much a Jekyll and Hyde character. On one hand, there was the jolly, outgoing, effervescent, brilliant speaker, a populist who could get a big smile on his face, and people would instinctively like him. And that Cyril Smith could be a very likeable, very charismatic character. And when he came down to Hove, it was the first time I'd ever met him. And we spoke together on the platform, spoke brilliantly, went down well with the audience, pleasant to me. My complete impression was, this is a good guy. And then I saw the other side. We had arranged that a taxi would be waiting to take him to the station, and that taxi would be at the back of the hall. Then he had to go from the platform down some steps and out the back door to get that taxi. So my agent took him down, and I was still on the platform, and I suddenly heard this commotion. And I went to see what was happening, and my agent, who was a man called John Holmes, a lovely man, was pinned against the wall, white and shaking, with Cyril's hand on his chest, and Cyril was absolutely bellowing at him. It turned out that while the taxi had been called, no one had arranged for the back door to be unlocked, so Cyril couldn't get out. And he was blaming this on John Holmes. And that jolly face that I'd seen on the platform had become like a slab of concrete. It was as hard as you could imagine a face to be. And it was a terrifying sight. And I called out, Cyril, your taxi's outside. And he stopped for a minute and looked at John Holmes. And I almost felt like he was thinking, will I punch him before I go or not? But in the end, he grudgingly came up and disappeared. But that night, I thought to myself, that man is not just one man. There are two people there.
In the book review, which we looked at, and we'll look at some other passages from it, you say that Cyril Smith used his grotesque physical size as a form of intimidation. Is that what you're describing here?
Yes, it was also if you were having an argument with him, and particularly if he was standing, he could stand quite close to you, and it was quite intimidating. I mean, I don't think I'm a coward, but I was always quite happy to get away from him. I just wanted to make a point about the threats that he would make, because when I was named to run the 92 general election, he sent Paddy Ashdown a note, which I think sums up Cyril Smith.
Well, just let me interrupt, Mr. Wilson, because I think
Yes.
we've still got that on screen, haven't we? Is that in
yes,
paragraph
you
11
have.
of your statement?
Paragraph 11.
So you say that this was in 1992, so that last period of your involvement.
Yes, this was when I was named in 1990. I was
Right.
named in 1990.
Named to be the election coordinator.
And he wrote, I wish to register my, and then he goes into capitals, strongest possible objections. And then he goes back to Des Wilson heading the GE team, and I will not, in capitals, be prepared to assist nationally if he does so. And then he put P.S., count me out. I'm disgusted and will say so publicly. Now, the point about that is it shows everything about him. First of all, the threats, that he would say something publicly if he didn't get his way. Secondly, that he never forgot a grudge. Because I only had the one big row with him, and that was after the book came out in 1987. But in 1990, he still wasn't going to have anything to do with me. And thirdly, the bullying, the belief that firing this off could somehow get the whole thing changed. It just summed him up, I thought.
I'm going to move on in a moment, Ms Wilson, and ask you some particular questions about the Private Eye article and so on. But before I do that, can I just ask you a more general question about Cyril Smith? Did you ever hear any rumours about his sexuality generally, and in particular whether he had had anything to do with the homosexual vice scene?
No.
Thank you. Let's move on then, as I say, to the Private Eye and the Rochdale Alternative Press articles, which both came out in 1979, in May 1979, didn't they? Let's in fact look, if we can, at the Private Eye article. It's INQ 30963 at page 4, and for you, Mr Wilson, and also for the Chair and panel, it's tab 2 in your bundle. Now, Mr Wilson, this was at that time when you weren't involved in frontline politics. It was after you'd stepped down.
That's correct. Following
the Hove by-election and before you'd come back in 1982, wasn't it?
That's correct.
And we've established that you were living in London at the time, or most of that time. Shall I give you the reference again? INQ 30963, page 4. That's it. So this is the Private Eye article, and you'll probably remember there was a larger article that appeared in the local newspaper, the Rochford Alternative Press. Rochdale. Let me just ask you quickly, did you read either or both of those two articles at the time they were published?
I read the Private Eye one at the time.
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to ask you some questions about what you made of that at the time. But before we do that, let's just look at the article, if we can, and blow it up. It was, in a sense, a précis of the Rochdale article, wasn't it, Mr Smith? It
yes.
picked up the core detail of it. And I particularly want just to look and see where it describes the particular allegations that were being made against Cyril Smith. So if we can, you see there's a paragraph there which says it publishes extracts from 3 men. So that's describing the Rochdale Alternative Press article. And then it briefly goes through the accounts given by the 3 men, doesn't it? So we see the next paragraph. The first man says that he'd missed a day off work, which was against the hostel rules. And just pausing there, these 3 men had all given that the accounts they gave were all of a time when they'd been in the Cambridge House boys' hostel in Rochdale, which was a hostel run by, or said Cyril Smith, or that he had a role in managing. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I recall this article.
Yes. Well, let's just look through those 3 accounts then. So the first man who'd said he'd missed a day off work, which was against the hostel rules, he was reported and interviewed by Cyril Smith. And then there's a quote from his statement. He gave me the choice between accepting his punishment or leaving the hostel. I said I would accept his punishment. He took me into the quiet room. He told me to take my trousers and pants down, and he hit me 4 or 5 times with his bare hands on my bare buttocks. So that was the first allegation. The second allegation is similar. An individual who was asked if he would accept punishment, and we can see that the individual said he would, and then that's Cyril Smith, told me to take off my trousers and pants and bend over his knee. He trapped my hands between his legs. He hit me many times with his bare hand, and I pleaded with him to stop because he was hurting me. This took place at the hostel. Afterwards, he came to my bedroom and wiped my bare buttocks with a sponge. And then the third incident was of a slightly different nature. That's that immediately below we see another man says, after a few days I was given a kind of medical examination by Cyril Smith. He told me to take my trousers and pants down. He held my testicles and told me to cough. So those were the accounts that had initially appeared in the local newspaper that Private Eye republished, as it were, in May 1979. Now, I'm going to come to your view as to the deficiencies, if you like, in the way that the Liberal Party responded to those allegations. But let me ask you before that, what do you think the Liberal Party should have done when those articles appeared in 1979? Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, but applying the standards of the time, what do you think they should have done?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I just instinctively believed them. And I just think if you knew Cyril Smith, it wasn't difficult to believe. But I would have thought the very first thing would have been that he should have been called in by the leader of the party and the chief whip and given a real going over. And then they should have said to him, well, look, Cyril, we've just got to have this properly looked into. We're going to have to set up some kind of internal inquiry because this is obviously dynamite. As I understand what happened is that he met David Steele and he said, oh, it was all in the past, the police have taken no action, and David Steele decided to leave it there. That's my understanding. But I certainly think, given that article, it's almost incredible that the party didn't immediately look into it properly.
I'm going to come then to the party's response, but first let me ask you, what was your response? You said that you read not the Rochdale Fuller account, but this Private Eye article we've just looked at.
Yes.
You weren't centrally involved in the party at the time, but you
I
were
wasn't
living in
involved
London.
at all.
I think you said you were still meeting your Liberal Party friends at the time, socially.
Yeah.
What was your reaction to this article, and what did you do about it?
Well, as I said to you, I just instinctively believed it. I took for granted that things would happen. It was so obvious that something would happen that it never crossed my mind I had to do anything.
Did you ask the people from the Liberal Party who you were meeting at the time what was happening about it?
No, I wasn't meeting a lot of people at the time, but no, I didn't. I just assumed, as I think most people would assume, that article would be acted upon, that the whole thing wouldn't just die. It seemed that would have seemed incredible to me.
Did you become aware that nothing was happening about it, and press people and say, well, why isn't this being pursued?
I'm afraid my memory's somewhat vague of the time, but I don't remember taking any particular action. I think I just assumed that things would happen.
Do you remember a man called Michael Steed who
Yes.
was involved in the Liberal Party at the time?
Yes.
I think he was president in 1978 and 79. You may or may not remember that.
I don't know.
But let me ask you, if you will, to have a look at the way he described his reaction to this article. The chair and panel have seen it once already this morning, but it's LDP 4011 at page 8. We can see. Do you see, Mr. Smith? This is a page of a document that Mr. Steed wrote.
Yeah.
You can see at the very bottom. It's dated last year, July 2018. But he's describing, amongst other things, his reaction to seeing that Private Eye article. And if we could zoom in on the second paragraph, please. He says this: in 1979, I became aware of the story about him, that's Cyril Smith, smacking boys that appeared in Private Eye. I can't now recall whether it was quoted to me over the phone or I was shown a copy, perhaps each in that order. I don't think I possessed a copy or had read it carefully until Tony Greaves sent me a copy after Cyril's death, which is obviously much later. My reaction has to be seen in the context of the time. The Private Eye story was certainly not to Cyril's credit, any more than the stories one heard in those days of how Tory cabinet ministers had caned small boys when they were school prefects. I had myself gone through a school system where caning was routine, and experienced a headmaster who clearly enjoyed caning boys on a casual whim. The Private Eye story was politically embarrassing, just like Cyril's known view on corporal punishment, but not as potentially embarrassing as what he might do when capital punishment came before the 1979 Parliament. What's your response to that description of this article?
Extraordinary, really. I think to kind of write it off as over those, that's what it was like in those days, is ridiculous. I mean, it's not as though there was just a sort of wild allegation. There were 3 specific cases quoted in some detail, and I would have thought that there was no way you could brush that aside. As I say, I wasn't involved in the party at the time. Michael was very much involved. I just assumed that this was a bombshell that would resonate.
Just before we move away from this, what about the suggestion that the allegations in that article were not as potentially embarrassing as Cyril Smith's controversial views about capital punishment?
Well, I don't agree with that. For a start off, Cyril Smith wasn't really a liberal. He was very, very right-wing, and he had these views, and I don't think people really took his specific views that seriously. His behaviour was a far more serious matter.
Right. Can we move away from this document, please, and go back to your book review, which is INQ 004084. And if we can go to page 5 in that, that's behind tab 3, Mr. Wilson, for you and for the chair and panel. So page 5, please. Could we zoom in on those 2 lines just above the photograph, please? I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Smith, so it's just actually the 2 lines at the bottom of that quote there. You refer to Cyril Smith having had more than 140 complaints made against him to the police. Do you know where you got that figure from?
It must have been from the book. I would have had no other way of knowing. It must have been from the book I was reviewing.
I see. Okay, so that's not independent knowledge on your part.
No, it is not. No.
You've just referred back to something you saw in the book. Okay, well, can we, in that case, go on to the next page, please? So it's page 6 within this document. And if we can just look at the first paragraph first, please. Now, you say here, as I've said, word was reaching London of the goings-on in his constituency, that's Cyril Smith's constituency, Rochdale. The private eye hints were there for all to take. But who was going to raise it with him? Just pausing there for a moment. Are you suggesting there that there were rumours beyond the private eye article?
No, I'm referring specifically to the private eye.
Just the private eye article. So going back to this, the question you ask is who was going to raise it with him? And then you say this: Steele just didn't want to know. The chief whip, a sanctimonious little creep called David Alton, whose career later self-destructed, was Smith's only genuine friend, and would never have challenged the giant thug. Now, colourful language, Mr. Wilson, but I think you may be being a little bit unfair on David Alton there.
Really?
He wasn't actually chief whip until 1985. I think it's right to say. So we're talking about events in May 1979.
Right.
And David Alton, in fact, had only been an MP for a few weeks at that stage, and he wasn't chief whip until 1985.
In so much as I describe him as chief whip, I am being unfair to him.
Let's have a quick look at David Alton's statement, because he's prepared a statement for the inquiry. It's INQ 001774, and it's tab 11 in your bundle, Mr. Wilson, if you want to look at it. And if we can go to... It's paragraph 10, sorry, I haven't got a page reference. Yes, so it's page 2. If we can just look at paragraph 10, we see there that Mr. Alton describes being chief whip in that later time, 1985. You accept that, I'm sure, Mr. Wilson? And if we can then go back and look at paragraph 5, please. So you see there that Mr. Alton describes that he was elected in a by-election. I think he was elected in a by-election only a few weeks before the 1979 general election, so he was elected twice within the space of a month or so. But in any event, only very shortly before the Private Eye article came out in May 1979. But while we're looking at this, we can see that at subparagraphs 1 and 4 here, Mr. Alton said, I saw neither of these publications in 1979 and was unaware of the allegations. And then he says further down at paragraph 4 there, no colleague ever spoke to me about these stories or allegations, and I never discussed it with Cyril Smith. Now, you describe in your statement, or the book review, Mr. Alton being a friend of Cyril Smith's.
He was certainly close to him, and they certainly tended to support each other. I would find this very believable because I, not that long ago, had dinner with a member of Parliament at the time who never saw the Private Eye article, and it was never mentioned to him. And that in itself, I think, sort of says quite a bit about the culture in that small parliamentary party, that no one wanted to rock the boat or raise something that was potentially difficult. So it was just not talked about.
Right, so it wasn't talked about and then a decision reached not to pursue it. It just wasn't talked about at all.
Well, certainly the MP at the time, who I had dinner with not so long ago, said to me he never saw the Private Eye, never knew anything about it at the time. So if David Alton says the same, I think that is believable.
Right, thank you. I'm going to move away from David Alton's statement, but Chair, can I invite you to adduce his statement into evidence? He's not coming to give evidence personally, but we will adduce it. Can I ask you then to look back at the book review, Mr. Wilson? I'm looking, so this is INQ 004084, and if we can go to page 6, which I think is the page we were on previously. Now, if we can zoom in on the paragraphs above the photograph and the paragraph below it as well, because this is the part of the article where you address the question of why nothing was done about this article at the time. And let's see what you say. You ask rhetorically, was there a deliberate, cynical cover-up by the leadership? I'm a believer in the cock-up theory of politics rather than the conspiracy one, you say. There were two questions. One, should Smith be confronted with the rumours? I doubt anyone had the appetite for that. Personally, it was a frightening prospect. Two, should there be a formal inquiry? Coming so soon after the Jeremy Thorpe scandal, politically it was potentially catastrophic. And then you say, just if we can just look at the single paragraph below the photograph, I think they got the biggest spade they could find, dug the biggest hole in the sand they could manage, and buried their collective heads in it, hoping the rumours were unfounded or that it would all go away. In other words, it was cowardice rather than conspiracy. And then you add, by now parliamentary party meetings were dominated by Smith, who had a permanent grievance. He was undervalued as a campaigner, and complete confidence that he, and he alone, was the voice of the man in the street. Now, just looking then at those various possibilities that you raise, the first one that you suggest as a possible solution was confrontation. What do you mean by that? Who would do the confronting and how?
Well, as I said to you earlier, I would have thought that the leader and the chief whip would have together, at least those two. I mean, I do recall back in the days of the Thorpe affair, when it was coming into the public eye, that there was a small meeting including David Steele and Emlyn Houston, I think was another one, who met with Jeremy Thorpe and confronted him.
Yes.
I think that in this situation I would have expected at least the leader and the chief whip to have sat down and not just accepted a throwaway that, oh, the police looked into that and there was nothing in it. I would have expected him to say, look, Cyril, this is pretty nasty reading. We can't just leave it there. We're going to have some sort of inquiry so that you can clear yourself if you are, in fact, innocent. But we can't just leave it there. It was astonishing, really, that it did kind of die nationally as a story. I would have thought it would have really taken off. But
what did you mean by your comment that confrontation would have been a frightening prospect?
Well, I wouldn't have wanted to do it. As I said to you, Cyril was a very intimidating man, and he would have been brutal in his defence, and I don't think that one would have been forgiven easily. If I couldn't be forgiven for a passing remark about him in a book, I would hardly be forgiven if I hauled him into a room and confronted him with this sort of allegation. So I think it would have been, yes, if I'd been party president and asked to sit in, I would not have looked forward to that at all.
And then the second alternative you raise is some sort of formal inquiry.
Yes.
And as you say, there had been an inquiry back in the early days of the Thorpe scandal.
Yes.
I think it was Lord Myers or
Byers.
Lord Byers, that's right.
Yes.
Who had been commissioned by David Steele and Lord Hewson to conduct an internal inquiry into Jeremy Thorpe. But that hadn't ended very well. And do you think that was one of the reasons why that may not have been an attractive solution in 1979?
No, if this sounds very critical of David Steele, I have to say I admire a lot of David Steele's qualities. He had a lot of outstanding qualities, but he didn't like confrontation at any time on anything. When you have him in front of you, you'll see that he's a moderate sort of speaker, and he does not like confrontation. He must have hated this article, and I think that he would have just not wanted it to go anywhere, really.
Well, that's really the point you make in that paragraph beneath the photo, isn't it, Mr. Wilson? I mean, you, having earlier on suggested cock-up and conspiracy, you seem to settle on a third answer, another C, cowardice.
Well, I think that's part of part of the cock-up.
All right. And then,
forgive the language. But
if we can go back to page 4 in the article, please, because this, I think, picks up your comments about Mr. Steele, Lord Steele as he now is. There's a section where you explain about Lord Steele's relationship with the party, and you suggest that he'd lost touch with the activists. But then, just picking it up 4 paragraphs above the bottom, but as Liberal leader, you say, but as Liberal leader he hated confrontation.
yes.
That's why he didn't want to hear about the nocturnal behaviour of some of those round that table, you mean the parliamentary party, because devoid of any need to actually campaign for worthwhile causes, heavens, they hated the word campaign, they had plenty of time for extramural activities. And herein lies part of the answer to the question, why was Smith not questioned about the rumours beginning to emerge from his political fortress of Rochdale, rumours that at the time were publicly referred to in private eye. And you say, you go on, apart from the fact no one would have had the courage to confront the Rochdale bully, a significant number of the wider parliamentary party had a guilty secret of one sort or another. They had no desire for questions to be raised about what MPs did in their ample spare time. Smith was protected as much by the culture within the parliamentary party as Savile was by the culture within the BBC.
Yes, I must stress, though, that when I talked about a guilty secret, I wasn't referring in any way to child abuse or any activity of that sort. I was merely making the point that quite a few of the MPs had some extracurricular going on in their lives and were particularly interested in their activities becoming a matter of public discussion.
You used the word cowardice in that earlier section we looked at, and there's a suggestion of cowardice in not wanting to confront Cyril Smith.
Yes.
But here you seem to be suggesting a slightly different sort of cowardice, perhaps a corporate cowardice, that confronting Cyril Smith or allowing issues about his private life to come into the public domain would threaten other members' private lives.
Yes, I have to say this is a part of the book review that I have some questions about my own mind, whether or not I overstated this a little bit. What I was trying to really say was that these weren't a group of very serious-minded politicians sitting around a table who, when something like this arose, would discuss it in a serious manner. They were all leading lives of various sorts, and a guilty secret would just be drinking too much, no more or less than that. But I do emphasise that the point that David Alton made and the point that my friend made, that they hadn't even seen the Private Eye article, and because it was never raised or an inquiry set up, never really knew about it, could possibly have applied to quite a few of them.
You give drinking too much as an example of the sort of guilty secret that you had in mind. You refer also to a particular case about a particular MP who you were aware of, who was visited by boys, as you describe it. Now, I'm not going to ask you who that MP was, but when you referred to boys in that article, what sort of age of person were you talking about?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think the panel's already had to confront this question of who are boys and who are not boys before. I'm part of a generation where it was not at all unusual to talk about 22, 23, 24-year-olds as boys. And in fact, in this case, that's precisely what I was doing. I think that I was careless in using the word boys. I think it was a mistake, and it's misleading.
But there was nonetheless, as a different example that you gave in the book, as well as someone who had a drinking habit, someone who was promiscuous with young men.
Yes.
And so I want to come back to this sentence that's still on the screen. You describe Smith as being protected by the culture within the Liberal Party, and you compare that to Jimmy Savile being protected by the culture within the BBC. So can you expand on what was the culture that you're referring to?
I'm talking about a culture of sort of self-interest, self-obsession, where they weren't really interested in what other people were doing. A kind of... They'd gone down to Westminster thinking that they were going to become major figures, didn't become major figures, and kind of had their own interests and spent a lot of time in their constituencies, which were nearly all marginal constituencies. And it was that kind of not really committed to the party culture that I'm really referring to here. I don't think I can put it any better than that. I just think that in this particular case, Steele saw Smith, nothing emerged from that. Some of the other MPs didn't even read the article. No inquiry was set up, so it kind of died. I mean, I admit that it's appalling that it did, and I don't understand how it could have, but it did.
Well, you described then the MPs being busy, being very caught up with events in their own constituencies, not perhaps having much time for their colleagues in London. But I think you may be suggesting in the article something that goes a bit further than that. Are you not suggesting a culture of cover-up, or at least not being too inquisitive into what their colleagues may have been up to?
Well, I think the second.
Let's just look at the way you put it in the article. If we can go to the first page of the article and look at the second paragraph. It starts, and it contains. You say, and it, that's Simon Danchuk's book, contains further damning evidence that those in power in this country, whether it be in politics, the church, the police or the BBC, here clearly we're focusing on politics and the Liberal Party, have until recently, and possibly still, been only too willing to turn a blind eye or even deliberately cover up any scandal that affects one of their own. Is that the charge that you were making against the Liberal Party?
Well, don't you think that's true? I mean, if you just for a moment think of the Savile case, it's inconceivable. There were scores of people in the BBC who knew about that. And likewise, in politics, I mean, there has been one Conservative MP who's been mentioned in this inquiry already over the last few days. I had certainly heard all about. And I think there was just a generally... we don't want to rock this boat. Once we start making a big issue of one person in the parliamentary party, where will it all lead? But it wasn't people sitting around and saying, we must cover this up at all costs. It's much more a kind of just keep out of the way.
But you mentioned the BBC and other political parties, but really this book and this article is about Cyril Smith and the Liberal Party,
sure.
Mr. Wilson, and that's what we want your evidence about.
Yeah, sure.
And is that the allegation that you're making about the Liberal Party and Cyril Smith, that either they turned a blind eye or even deliberately covered up the allegations that they knew about him?
Yeah. But with respect, you did read out the whole paragraph, and that paragraph wasn't making the whole point about
yes.
other institutions, so I think it was quite right to refer to it. But having said that, yes, I just think, in the case of the private eye thing, it should have been addressed really definitively at the time, and it wasn't. And clearly no one felt a need to push it, either because they didn't know about it, they'd missed it completely, or because they just simply didn't want to start stirring things up.
Thank
I mean,
you.
I can't explain to you, you can't ask me to explain to you why the parliamentary party didn't act. I find it amazing, but I wasn't involved in the party at the time, and I cannot explain to you why they didn't.
No, well, you've explained it very well, Mr. Wilson. We're very grateful. There's only one other question I wanted to ask you, and it's a slightly different. It's on a slightly different issue, and that's you may or may not be aware that, in fact, around the time the book was published, even a little bit before that, the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrat Party, as it was by then, conducted an investigation of its own into what had been known about the allegations about Cyril Smith and what was done. In 2012, in fact, that investigation took place. As part of that investigation, people who had been involved in the party in earlier years were approached and asked for their account. Were you approached and asked for your account?
No.
Okay. Just bear with me a moment. No, thank you, Mr. Wilson. Those are all the questions that I have for you. It may be that the Chair or members of the panel have questions for you.
Just one question, thank you, Mr. Wilson. In relation to the allegations about Cyril Smith that were referred to in Private Eye and the RAP, in your opinion, would there be a distinction made between what were potentially criminal allegations and some of the other activities that have just been referred to, such as extramarital affairs or heavy drinking?
I think if you started looking into extramarital affairs in the House of Commons, you could never stop. So I don't think that would be regarded as, I mean, the leader or chief whip might say to an MP, I think you're being a bit careless here, or whatever, but a criminal activity of this kind would surely, I would have expected to be treated with the utmost seriousness.
And was it your opinion that you could trust the Parliamentary Liberal Party to have made that distinction?
I don't know.
Thank you. We have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. We'll now take our lunch break.
Thank you, Chair.
Please sit.
And if you could repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but.
and nothing but the truth.
So help me God.
First of all, can you give us your full name, please?
My name is David Martin Scott Steele, known in the House of Lords as Lord Steele of Wickwood.
Thank you, Lord Steele. You made a statement to the inquiry, which I'm going to adduce in full, INQ 002748. And perhaps we can put it up on screen. Tell us something about your career in politics, please.
I was elected in a by-election in 1965 as an MP, and have held the seat ever since until I retired in 1997. John Major put me in his dissolution list during the election, so I had no break at all. I served so many years in the Commons, and I went straight into the House of Lords.
Yeah. And you went into the House of Lords in
97.
June 87 or 97?
97.
Leader of the Liberal Party between 1976 and 1988.
Correct.
Is that right? Leader of the Lib Dems, March 1988 to July 1988.
Correct.
And you were also a Liberal Chief Whip in 1970 to 1976.
I think it was 75, but around then, yes.
Right.
I started after the 70 election.
The first thing I'd like to ask you for your assistance with, Lord Steele, is this. Cyril Smith, really. What did you make of him as a colleague in the Liberal Party?
Well, I listened to the evidence this morning of Des Wilson. I thought he put it very well, that he was a rather Jekyll and Hyde character. I think in my written statement I've told how after the party leadership election, when he had supported my opponent, John Pardo, he said that he wouldn't speak in any constituency that had voted for me.
For you, yeah.
So that was... he was a sort of prickly character.
Yes. In your third paragraph of your statement, you say he was a difficult colleague. Is that a reasonable statement or an understatement?
I think it was an accurate statement. Yes, he was a difficult colleague. He could be quite difficult on a number of issues, yes.
We know he was elected in the by-election in 1972 for Rochdale, but had first been selected as a prospective parliamentary candidate in 1970. And you tell us something about selection panels. I don't need to ask you about that. Did you ever become aware during the period when you were in Parliament and he had become one of your parliamentary colleagues of any historic allegations into child sexual abuse that concerned him?
Not at all, until I read The Private Eye.
We'll come to that in a moment. Had you not even heard that he had been investigated by Lancashire Police?
No.
Between 1969 and 1970, the papers had gone up to the DPP.
I knew nothing about that.
Nothing at all?
No.
So not one of your parliamentary colleagues had ever told you that?
Nope.
Not even heard it on the grapevine?
Nope, nothing at all.
Not from any of the whips? No one?
Nothing.
Let's then have a look, please, at the at the articles. We have them in hard copy, Lord Steele, behind tab 2 in the file that you have, the second tab. But if once you've found that, what I'd like you to do, first of all, is to go, please, to page 5, because that's the original article, INQ 000963 at page 5, from which the Private Eye article was derivative. So
I'm sorry, page
5 within that document.
That's not part of the Private Eye piece.
It's not, because it's the RAP, the Rochdale
Yes.
Alternative Paper article.
Can I just make this point too, that I never saw this Rochdale account until I got these papers. All I went on was the Private Eye story.
All right, well, let's just focus then on the Private Eye story. So we need to go back a single page to page 4. And we had part of this in evidence this morning, but if we focus on about halfway down where the article deals with the allegations.
Can I just make a point before you get that far? I think the first sentence is very important.
Yes.
If I may read it out. There is not an important newspaper or TV station in the land which has not received a copy of the May issue of the Rochdale Alternative paper. And the reason I say that's important is because of what Des Wilson said this morning, when he said that he had come across at least 2 MPs who had never seen Private Eye.
Yeah.
It's possible that I might not have seen Private Eye, but I happen to be a subscriber to that excellent magazine, and so I had read it. But if I hadn't read it, I wouldn't have known anything about this at all. The Rochdale Observer, although they circulated it to newspapers and so on, they'd never sent me a copy. And I received no inquiries from any paper or any letter or telephone call or anything about it.
But it so happened that you were a subscriber.
Yes.
And because you were a subscriber, Private Eye is what you saw. The article from which it derived, the Rochdale Alternative paper, was something you were completely unaware of.
I've never seen it, yeah.
All right. Let's just look at some of the detail. There's a paragraph which begins, "The first man says," and we had this morning. The first man says that he had missed a day off work. Have you been able to find that?
Yeah, I follow you.
You got that? Good.
Yeah.
The first man says that he'd missed a day off work, which was against the hostel rules, and he was talking about Cambridge House. He was reported and interviewed by Cyril Smith. His statement goes on, "He gave me the choice between accepting his punishment or leaving the hostel. I said I'd accept his punishment. He took me into the quiet room, told me to take my trousers and pants down, and hit me 4 or 5 times with his bare hands on my bare buttocks." The second man's statement says, "Cyril Smith found that I'd taken some money, asked me if I would accept his punishment or be dealt with by the authorities. I said I would accept his punishment. He then told me to take off my trousers and pants and bend over his knee. He trapped my hands between his legs. He hit me many times with his bare hand, and I pleaded with him to stop because he was hurting me. This took place at the hostel. Afterwards, he came to my bedroom and wiped my bare buttocks with a sponge." Another man says, "After a few days, I was given a kind of medical examination by Cyril Smith. He told me to take my trousers and pants down. He held my testicles and told me to cough." And the RAP editors say they have 4 other sworn statements from men who alleged similar spankings or inspections. Do you accept, on the face of it, the allegations weren't limited to the spanking of bottoms, but they appear, if accurate, to have included allegations which were far more serious?
Well, I accepted the article as presumably correct, and which is why I questioned Cyril Smith about it.
Right. Now, when you questioned Cyril Smith about it, can you tell us the circumstances in which you did so? We know that these articles were published. Well, the original Rochdale Alternative paper article was published in May. There was a follow-up article in June, but the Private Eye article came hot on the heels, it appears, of the Rochdale Alternative paper article. So when you spoke to Cyril Smith about it, was it around that time, May
yes,
1979?
it would have been immediately after the 79 election, I guess.
So around the very same time, May, presumably?
Yes.
Yeah. And where did you see him? In your an office in Parliament or in Liberal headquarters?
In the House of Commons.
By appointment or an
No,
informal meeting?
It was simply a conversation.
And how did the conversation go?
Well, I was afraid you'd ask for that because 40 years later it's a bit difficult to remember the precise conversation.
Lord Steele, nobody's expecting a verbatim account.
No.
But what was the nature of what you said to him?
What I said to him was, "What's all this about you in Private Eye?"
Yeah.
And he said, rather to my surprise, "It is correct." that he had been in charge of or had some supervisory role in a children's hostel, that he'd been investigated by the police, and that they had taken no further action. And that was the end of the story.
So should we take from that that it was a very, very brief discussion?
I think it was fairly brief, yes.
Confrontational?
No, not really. I was just trying to find out whether this was correct or not, and it was.
Now, how did he react to it? Apart from the words that he spoke to you, we've heard something about his character and his size and his intimidatory nature. Did he exhibit any of that to you during the course of this discussion?
Not at all, no.
Had he ever, in any circumstances?
No, I never felt intimidated by him. I was annoyed by him sometimes, but that was another matter.
Did you go into any detail with him? Did you say, well, look, Cyril, we're not just talking about the spanking of bottoms, we're talking about allegations about you holding boys' testicles?
I didn't have the magazine with me, so I wasn't going into the detail. I was just saying I'd read this in the paper. Yeah. What had he to say? Now, what I would ask you to remember is that this was 1979. We were talking about an investigation 2 decades previously, when he had been a Labour councillor.
One decade previously.
Sorry?
It was 1969.
Was it 69?
69.
I thought it was earlier than that.
No, the Lancashire investigation was 1969 to 1970.
I didn't know that. Anyway, it was quite old, but it was certainly before he was an MP and before he was even a member of my party.
Yes.
My point was that he had gone on since then to be Mayor of Rochdale, to be given the MBE for services to local government. Then he joined the Liberal Party. He'd been elected as MP with increasing majorities, I think, 4 times. So I saw no reason or no locus to go back to something that had happened during his time as a councillor in Rochdale.
Why did you raise it with him at all then?
Because I was concerned, having read the thing in private eye. I mean, it seemed quite natural to ask him about it.
What was the concern, that it might be true?
Sorry?
What was the concern, that it might be true?
Yes.
Even despite the fact that there had been an investigation which had come to nothing?
Well, I didn't know that at the time.
So you so that we understand you, are you saying that it wasn't even apparent to you, Lord Steele, that he'd been investigated by that time and the DPP had decided not to prosecute?
I don't remember the DPP coming into the conversation at all. It was simply that he had been investigated, that was correct, and no further action had been taken, which I assumed to be a police matter.
Yeah. But my question is, if by the time you were speaking to Cyril Smith about this, you had understood there had been a police investigation which in effect had come to nothing, what was the need for you to speak to him at all?
Well, as I say, all I knew was what was in private eye, and because it was in private eye, it was in the public domain, I thought it was only right to ask him about it.
Well, let's imagine for a moment, and I appreciate that this is a hypothetical situation, but what if Cyril Smith, instead of saying that the article is correct, but it all came to nothing because it was investigated, he actually said, well, I did do these things to those boys. How would you have dealt with it?
Well, he didn't say that to me.
No, but that's why I'm asking you for a hypothetical question. What if he had said it?
As I said in my written statement, my personal opinion is that he was misusing his role as whatever his supervisory role was. He was misusing it.
Well, can I ask you what you did mean? If you've got paragraph 8 of your statement in front of you, please. If you go back, that's behind your first tab. And perhaps we can put it up on screen, please. INQ 002748.
Paragraph 8.
8.
Paragraph 8?
8, please, yes.
Yeah.
You say, I took no further action. This is the 4th line down. I took no further action as the report referred to events before he was even a member of the Liberal Party. It seemed to me that he had possibly exceeded his role as a local Labour councillor. What did you mean by those words?
Well, he claimed that he had been had some supervisory role in the hostel as a counsellor,
Right.
which entitled him to do these things, which I disagreed with, but still, that was his view.
As you mention it, one of the excuses he was giving you... Are you able to hear me, Lord Steele? All right. One of the excuses he gave you was that as a Labour councillor and having some supervisory or management role within this hostel, he was permitted to, perform medical inspections?
That was the impression he gave, yes.
What was your response to that?
Well, I don't think we went into detail on the individual bits of the private eye story. He just accepted that the story was correct. And obviously I disapproved, but it was, as far as I was concerned, past history.
Was there any policy that the Liberal Party at that time had when accusations of this nature were made, or if such accusations were made, or any accusations made of serious crime against a member of Parliament within the party, how that would be dealt with?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Was there any policy or any safeguarding type of policy at this time in relation to allegations of offences committed towards children?
Well, I don't think it had happened before, so I wasn't aware of it anyway, no.
And we know that no formal inquiry was held.
No.
And that was the end of it.
That was the end of it. As I say, I might not even have read Private Eye, in which case we'd never have heard of it.
But you did?
I did, yes.
And because you did, you had the conversation you've told us about, albeit it was a relatively short conversation. Yeah. Were you prepared to take his word for it?
Yes, well, he didn't deny it.
No.
So, of course, I took his word for it.
Well, he didn't deny the terms of the Private Eye article and the fact that he'd been investigated, but as to whether he had actually committed the offences of which these men were accusing him, was that a topic which ever arose?
I don't think we went into the conversation that deeply, no.
So you came away from that meeting, Lord Steele, not really knowing if he'd committed these offences at all?
Well, I assumed he had, because he said that the account was correct. Why would he have been investigated if he hadn't done something that was possibly wrong?
So you understood that he'd actually committed these offences from what he said to you?
I assumed that.
Right. Wasn't that all the more reason to take matters further and hold some form of inquiry?
No, because it was, as I say, before he was an MP, before he was even a member of my party. It had nothing to do with me.
We heard this morning that there was a formal inquiry launched by the party into Jeremy Thorpe. Was that qualitatively different in any way to...
Yes, because it was current.
It was current?
It was current.
What gave you the confidence, Lord Steele, that if Cyril Smith was confessing to you in 1979 that 10 years or more before he had been assaulting children, that he wasn't continuing to do it on your watch?
Well, he was no longer involved with the children's home, and indeed it had closed down.
You're right about that. But
Sorry?
You're right about that. But did you not think that what if Cyril has access to other children, he could be doing this again?
Well, I had no such suspicion or reason to think that.
Had you ever heard of Knollview School?
No.
Where he would allow himself into the premises on occasions and would visit the school, which was a school for boys. Did you appreciate that?
Well, I think that was in the Private Eye story, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't.
Was it not?
No, but my point is, if Cyril Smith, during this meeting, has admitted to you, in effect, that he was guilty of the accusations, the question arises,
well,
why...
You have to be careful about the word guilty, because, of course, he was... no further action was taken.
I'm not using it in the guilty or not guilty sense, Lord Steele, you understand, but in the sense he's confessing to you that he has committed these acts which have been alleged against him. And I'm seeking to understand from you why that was the end of the matter, you being Liberal Party leader at this point, why you did nothing about it.
Simply because, as I repeat, he was not an MP at the time, he wasn't even a member of my party, so I didn't feel that I had any locus in the matter at all, but other than being a reader of the magazine.
Get that, but you understand the points I'm making.
Yes.
He could, for all you knew, still be offending against children.
That never. I had to admit that never occurred to me, and I'm not sure it would occur to me even today.
Yeah. Now, you say that it was only private eye that you were aware of, and that you hadn't seen the Rochdale alternative paper. But can I ask you about this, please? In the file behind tab 2, and can we put this up on the screen? I'm not sure if...
Which tab is it?
Tab 2, please. And if you go to the 6th page, you'll see 006. In the bottom right-hand corner, INQ 000963, page 6.
Yeah, I got it. With the photograph of Sir Earl Smith on it. Yeah.
That's the one. I'm not sure we're able to bring up the... ideally, we would have pages 2 and 3 together. But you'll know what I'm about to ask you, Lord Steele. There's a quotation which begins just under the photograph.
Under the photograph?
Yeah. I have to read across to the 3rd page, which isn't up on screen, and I don't think we can do a split screen. But the way it reads is, it's a quotation, and you have been asked about this before. It's not a very friendly gesture, publishing that. All he seems to have done is spanked a few bare bottoms, and the quotation is attributed to David Steele's press office, the 22nd of April 1979.
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm afraid I didn't have the luxury of a press officer, so
No.
It was the party press office.
Yeah.
And he may well have said that, I don't know.
Would it be something that you would have approved?
Well, that's a hypothetical question. I don't think it was ever discussed. So, in fact, I'm sure it was never discussed because I would remember if anyone had mentioned it.
The date of it is the 22nd of April. And if the date is accurate and the publication date for this Rochdale Alternative Paper article is also accurate...
This was coming out during the election then?
Well, it predated. The quotation...
Yeah.
is alleged to have predated, or is said to have predated, the publication date of the RAP article.
Right.
You'll see it's in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So it suggests, the internal logic of it is it suggests that somebody gave that quotation to the RAP. And it suggests also, I understand that you say you didn't have a personal press officer, but it was a party officer. Do you think, as leader of the Liberal Party at the time, that anyone in that office would have put out a statement of that nature without your approval to it?
Oh yes, that's perfectly possible, and in fact I'm sure that's what happened because I would have heard about it. But if it was the 12th of April, that would have been actually during the election.
22nd of April.
Well, even more the 22nd of April. I forget what the date of the election was, but it would certainly have been running at that time.
Yeah.
I would have been up in Scotland. I was nowhere near the party headquarters.
Right. So we should understand that somebody was willing to put out a press statement which was...
Well, was it a press statement or was it an answer to a query from the paper?
I can't tell you.
No,
but
I suspect from the look of it, it was the paper ringing up party headquarters and getting this comment from a press officer.
Bit of a silly thing to have said, though, don't you agree?
Quite possibly, yes.
A silly thing to have said, not least on its own terms, but also because anybody looking at this would think it had the leader of the Liberal Party's approval.
Yes. I see what you mean, yeah.
But it rather trivialises what these young men had alleged. And not only does it trivialise it...
Well, of course, we don't know what he was being told. Presumably this was over the telephone.
What one might assume, but at the same time, it's a trivialisation of spanking of bare bottoms when we know that the allegations were far more serious. It was the cupping of boys' testicles and that kind of activity. But what you say in your witness statement in paragraph 8, you don't need to turn back to it, but you actually said, the paper said that this was stated by the press office on my...
Sorry, just a minute, let me get...
Do you want to go back to it?
Which paragraph are we at?
Paragraph 8.
Yeah, okay.
You'll see at the last 3 lines. the paper said this was stated by the press office on my direction. Now, to be fair to you, Lord Steele, the paper doesn't appear to say that at all.
Oh, right.
But what you say is that's extremely unlikely, but after the passing of nearly 40 years, I can't be absolutely certain. So it is the situation you don't have, and nobody would expect you to have, but is the situation you don't have a particular memory of this at all, this quotation?
As I say, you pointed out the date to me, which is actually quite important.
Yeah.
I would have been up in Scotland in the election campaign, nowhere near the party headquarters, and certainly not in a position to make any comment to a press officer.
Yeah.
But now reading that again, I think I'm absolutely certain it was not put out on my behalf.
No.
Or with my authority.
If that's right, did anybody ever bring to your attention that had gone out as if it had come from you or your office?
As I say, I knew nothing about any of this until I read Private Eye.
Well, this is all happening around the same time.
Yes, but what the date of publication of Private Eye must have been later than that, wasn't it?
Of course, but I think around the same time.
Yeah.
Maybe a week or so afterwards. If somebody had brought to your attention, after you had read the Private Eye article, that this wasn't just about spanking a few bare bottoms, but it was more serious than that, would you have done anything to have countermanded what had been said apparently by you or on your behalf?
That's a double hypothetical question, because I didn't know that had been said, so I'm not sure if I can answer that.
Well, it is hypothetical, but what I'm asking, Lord Steele, is for how you would have dealt with this if it had been brought to your attention. There is a hypothesis there,
well, if it had
but
been
I'm asking for the nature of your approach would have been.
Yeah, if it had been brought to my attention, obviously I'd have been concerned about it, but it wasn't brought to my attention, so that was the end of the matter.
Can I ask you now, please, to go behind tab 5 in the bundle? And it was something Baroness Brinton was asked about this morning. It's INQ 003954.
Yeah. Right.
If that can go up on the screen, please. And these are minutes of a meeting of the National Executive held on Friday, the 11th of May, 1979, at the Midland Hotel, Manchester. Now, nobody says that you were there. Did you know of Claire Brooks?
Yes, I do. I remember her, yes.
And you've heard the description Baroness Brinton gave this morning.
Yes, I thought very accurate. Yeah.
And you agree with it?
Yeah, she was a substantial figure in the party.
Turn the page, please, in the documents. Have you got the second page of it? I think you probably have. And if we go towards the bottom, where we see her name, Claire Brooks.
Yeah.
Claire Brooks expressed her extreme disquiet at the unfair tactics used by opponents of the Liberal Party. There had been one particularly damaging article in a northern regional newspaper and other notable instances of unethical behaviour demonstrated by the major parties. The Executive was firmly of the opinion that if any candidate believed that adequate grounds existed, the possibility of taking legal action should be seriously considered. Looking back now, do you think, or are you able to help, whether what she might have been talking about by way of unfair tactics, in this particular instance, a damaging article in a northern regional newspaper could have applied to anything other than the article in the Rochdale Alternative paper?
It might have been a reference to the article in the Rochdale paper. I just don't know.
You don't know.
Or it might have been, as Baroness Brinton was saying, something entirely different.
And so if I was to ask you the question whether at the time people might have just seen that as something that was simply scurrilous and done in order to gain political advantage, is that perhaps how some people might have seen things at that time?
Well, it must have been, because this paper, I don't know what its circulation was, but presumably
it was about 8,000.
8,000 circulating in Rochdale. Presumably its readership was more than 8,000. And yet, as I say, Cyril Smith was constantly being re-elected. So, and none of these rumours or allegations came to us, or nobody wrote in to us, or phoned us, or raised any questions. It's very strange. So it must have been dismissed as scurrilous, I suppose.
Now, you succeeded Jeremy Thorpe in office as leader in May 1976, I think I'm right in saying?
Yeah.
When he resigned over the Scott affair. Had you ever heard of anybody called Andre Thorne? You have been asked about him.
Audrey?
Thorne.
No.
Name doesn't mean anything to you. I think I'm right in saying that Jeremy Thorpe was tried at the Old Bailey 3 years later during a trial lasting 6 weeks beginning on the 8th of May 1979. Does that ring true to you? It was around that period, the trial?
Sorry?
May 1979, the Thorpe trial. Is that about right?
I can't remember exactly, but it was around that time, yes.
So all of this is going on at the same time. We've got Cyril Smith allegations in Private Eye, following on from the Rochdale Alternative paper allegations in May 1979. We've got the Thorpe trial going on. These are all huge things for you to navigate, presumably, as the Liberal leader around that time.
Yes, the Thorpe thing was a very ghastly experience.
And as I say, you have, around the same time, Private Eye building on the allegations in a local newspaper exposing Cyril Smith, who's got away, as it were, without being tried for allegations of child sexual abuse. Do you think, looking back now, that your reaction to the Smith publicity, coming as it was during the very time all of this was going on, may have informed your judgment about what to do?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I've obviously thought about it because that's the allegation in some of the other statements that have been submitted to this inquiry. I really don't think so. I don't think there was any connection between the two things at all.
So you don't think perhaps the reality of inaction by the party on Smith was because the party simply couldn't afford another scandal at the same time as Thorpe?
Absolutely not. As I say, the party was unaware of all this, and I could easily have been unaware of it if I hadn't been a contributor to Private Eye.
Exactly. But the fact is, as I've said already, you were.
Yeah.
Did you find out or know whether any of your colleagues had read...
It was never discussed at all.
And you've been able to see the statements of other colleagues of yours, Michael Meadowcroft, David Alton, who say that they didn't know about any of this. So it was pure coincidence, pure chance that because you were a subscriber, you did know, but to the exclusion of anyone else.
Exactly so.
A matter of interest, did you, having spoken to Cyril Smith about these matters, then go and speak to some of your senior colleagues and say, have you heard about these allegations? Cyril's just confessed to me that he did it.
No, I never discussed it with anybody else.
Was there a reason for that?
It wasn't a matter of public discussion at all.
Well, not public, but your...
No, I mean, even within the parliamentary party.
You didn't want to take advice? You didn't see the need to take advice?
No.
No. Now, you've heard, as you indicated, Des Wilson's evidence this morning, and I think I remember you saying that you agreed with his characterisation.
Yes.
Do you also agree with what he said in his witness statement, that Cyril Smith was a monstrous character?
Well, I think that's pitching it a bit high, but I thought his statement this morning was reasonably accurate, yes.
And why people tended not to confront him?
I'm not sure that that's true. I think in politics, it doesn't matter what your physical size is or anything like that. I think if people had been seriously concerned about allegations against him, they would have confronted him.
Yeah. Would you kindly turn to tab 6? Tab 6, because we've got Des Wilson's statement there.
Yeah.
It's INQ 003670 at page 4, and I'd like you to turn to paragraph 15, please.
Paragraph
15 on the 4th page.
I don't have a 15.
You should do. Paragraph 15 on the 4th page. It'll go up on the screen. Have you got that?
Yeah, I've got it on the screen, yes.
Okay. And this is what Des Wilson had to say in the statements he made to the inquiry. I've been asked about the party's response to the private eye disclosures. If you knew Smith, you would understand why no one would raise the accusations with him. No one would want to create that kind of enemy. Note his response to my general election involvement referred to above. I have no idea why no action was taken after the Private Eye article, but then I wasn't around, and perhaps Steele did discuss it with him. We know you did. Though Steele's natural tendency, in my view, would be to hide his head in the sand rather than get involved in a nasty confrontation. Now, do you recognise that about yourself?
That's a pardonable exaggeration, I would say.
Which is the exaggeration?
I wouldn't have been hiding my head in the sand. As I've explained to you, these allegations all related to a period some years before, and before he was an MP and before he was even a member of the party. Therefore, it didn't seem to me that I had any position in the matter at all. Yeah.
Well, which you've explained. Now, behind tab 7, there is the book review which Des Wilson wrote for the Mail on the 27th of April 2014.
Yeah.
And if we can put that up, please, INQ 004084.
Page 4? Right.
Just a moment, please.
Yes,
if you go to page...
I've marked it when I read this because he says, herein lies part of the answer to the question, why was Smith not questioned about the rumours beginning to emerge from his political fortress of Rochdale? Rumours at that time were publicly referred to in Private Eye. Well, I've explained why nothing was done about it, because nobody knew about it.
But if you look at page 4, it's a little before that, in fact, in that paragraph I wanted to ask you, but as Liberal leader, he hated confrontation. That's why he didn't want to hear about the nocturnal behaviour of some of those round that table, because devoid of any need to actually campaign for worthwhile causes, they had plenty of time for extramural activities, and herein lies part of the answer to the question, why was Smith not questioned about the rumours beginning to emerge from his political fortress of Rochdale? And so Des Wilson has, in this book review, and indeed in his witness statement, claims that you dislike confrontation, and my question is, was that true or false?
Well, I think I tend, the whole of my political life, to be more in favour of seeking compromises rather than confrontation, yes. I mean, it was quite interesting listening to Des this morning that he's rode back a bit from this rather diatribe article to say, well, it was just a book review. And there was a history to it because he actually fell out. This didn't come up in the evidence this morning. But after he'd been in charge of the election in '92, he rather fell out with my successor, Paddy Ashdown. I don't know the reasons why, I'm afraid. I can't enlighten you on that. But they did have a big fallout, and Des became a bit bitter, and hence this rather anti-article that appeared in the Mail.
So from your perspective and your understanding, we should understand the nature, perhaps, of this article against that background?
Yeah.
Can you go, please, within the article to page 6, something that Des was asked about this morning? At the top, was there a deliberate, cynical cover-up by the leadership? I'm a believer in the cock-up theory of politics rather than the conspiracy one. There were 2 questions. One, should Smith be confronted with the rumours? I doubt anyone had the appetite for that. Personally, it was a frightening prospect. 2, should there be a formal inquiry? Coming so soon after the Jeremy Thorpe scandal, politically it was potentially catastrophic. And then beneath the photograph, as you heard quoted this morning, I think they got the biggest spade they could find, dug in the biggest hole in the sand they could manage, and buried their collective heads in it, hoping the rumours were unfounded or that it would all go away. In other words, it was cowardice rather than conspiracy. By now, parliamentary party meetings were dominated by Smith, who had a permanent grievance. He was undervalued as a campaigner, and complete confidence that he and he alone was the voice of the man in the street. And added to that, Lord Steele, there were allegations that because the Liberal Party was a small parliamentary party, the party could ill afford to lose Smith. And therefore, rather than confront him, one had to live with him in order to, as it were, protect the party. Was there any element of that going on?
I really don't think so. I think this is all of this passage is a bit of an exaggeration on Des's part, and it stems from the fact that, as I say, the allegations related to the time before he was even a member of the party, and that nobody knew about them. So how could there be a sort of determination by the party to cover up something they didn't even know about?
I know, but I come back to the point I asked you to consider earlier, which is how could anybody be confident? And you were uniquely in possession of his confession. How could you in particular, and the party more generally, be confident that Cyril Smith wasn't continuing to offend in the way he'd confessed to you that he had?
I don't think the issue arose. I mean, it wasn't a question of being confident about it. It just didn't cross our minds.
You've seen Dominic Carman's witness statement, which deals with the knowledge he attributes to his father about Smith's activities over some years. If Dominic Carman is accurate about that and that his father had known what Cyril Smith had been doing for years, have you any idea how George Carman might have known that, the father, but not you?
Unless, like me, he was a reader of Private Eye. No, I don't have any idea.
But over years, is the impression that Dominic Carman gives is that George had known about Cyril Smith's proclivities for some years.
Well, he might have known about the what we call the 69 inquiries. Yeah,
I see. And in terms of shutting down the press noise about it, specifically during the Thorpe trial, if solicitors were instructed, did the party have anything to do with that? If solicitors
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
If solicitors were instructed to stop the media reporting the allegations against Smith during the Thorpe trial in 1979...
But I don't think they were.
Well, that's what Dominic Carman tends to suggest. If Lord Goodman or somebody else had been instructed, did the party have anything to do with it?
Certainly not. I'm totally unaware of that.
Was Lord Goodman a Liberal Party solicitor?
No, but he was I think, a friend of Jeremy Thorpe's. That I do remember.
Now, can we please go back to your witness statement, which is behind the first tab for you. Paragraph 10, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, which tab is it?
It's
tab 2.
Tab 1, I think, your witness statement is. Paragraph 10, which is...
Paragraph 10, okay.
Paragraph 10 on the second page.
Yeah.
And this is about Cyril Smith's knighthood. Was it a matter of course in the Liberal Party that a long-standing or an MP of long-standing service would be recommended for a knighthood?
It was true across all parties, yeah.
And you understood after 15 years' service, and by 1998 Smith was in poor health and wasn't going to stand again as an MP. I think he retired, didn't he, in the 1992 election?
Did he?
Was it the 1992 election that Smith stood down?
Yes, I think so.
I think he got his knighthood.
Yes, it must be, that must be a mistake, 1998.
Yes, no, it should be 1988, shouldn't it?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, not at all, but he got his knighthood, if my memory serves me, in 1988.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And you say, I passed the recommendation that he should be knighted to the Prime Minister in the normal way, and it was vetted by the Honours Scrutiny Committee.
Yes.
And you say, I know they do a thorough job because they had refused my nomination of an individual for an OBE on the grounds that he had once bounced a cheque. I didn't pass on any allegations about Smith sexually abusing children to the Honours Scrutiny Committee because I wasn't aware of any such allegations, other than the matters referred to above, which is a reference to your witness statement, which, as I say, appeared to have been fully investigated and had been reported on by Private Eye. The problem, may I suggest, is Cyril Smith had confessed to you that he had committed the acts which the magazine had published. Did you think that that was something that you should, even in confidence, tell the Honours Committee about?
No, it never occurred to me to tell the Honours Committee about it, but that it was all, in a sense, in the public domain through Private Eye. Yeah.
And you felt that sufficed?
But what I can say is that if I'd had any suspicion that these activities had been continuing or had been involved in any activity after he'd been an MP, then I certainly would not have recommended him for knighthood.
How often did you...
That would have been my natural instinct.
I was going to ask what you would have done.
Yeah.
How often did you ever approach Cyril Smith after the conversation you had
Never.
in 1979 to say, is any of this still going on, Cyril?
Never.
So you just didn't...
I'd no reason to.
So you didn't know?
No.
And so you never found out before recommending him for a knighthood as to whether this activity might have been continuing for years as an MP?
No.
Do you think you ought to have done, looking back?
Sorry?
Do you think you ought to have done?
No, I don't think so. I have something to say about the Danzig book later on, if you want to come to that. But
well, if there is something that's relevant to this, by all means.
Well, there was one thing that puzzled me about the Danzig book. I've said in my written statement why I think he wrote it and the political reasons behind it. But there was one reference in it, and I read the book again recently before coming to give evidence here.
Smile for the camera is the
yes,
book. Yeah.
Yes, I read it again recently. And there's an interesting reference to Michael Foot, who was then leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party. And there are two different accounts, and I don't know whether they come from the same person or not, but I rather assume they must have done, because why otherwise would Michael Foot have come into it? In the book, there's a reference to Cyril Smith taking a boy to the House of Commons, and the boy witnesses a conversation between Cyril Smith and Michael Foot. That's perfectly possible, I don't know, but that's in the book. There's a newspaper account which says that he took this boy to his room and engaged in sexual activity with him, and it was a room where Michael Foot passed by. That, I know, is completely wrong for two reasons. One is that Cyril Smith didn't have a room. He had a desk in a room shared with 4 or 5 others, any of whom could have walked in at any time, so that sounds unlikely. Also, it was, because I remember it well, I was responsible as chief whip for allocating the desks in the rooms. It was up a little stair above the members' cloakroom, nowhere near where Michael Foot's office was, so he wouldn't have been walking past. So for these reasons, I think I had grave doubts about whether these allegations were correct. But these all came out after Smith's death. Yeah. So there was no way I could ask him.
But the allegations you knew to be true were the ones...
Sorry?
The allegations you knew to be true were the ones that Cyril Smith had confessed to?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember Lord Steele appearing on a Newsnight programme on the 4th of June last year?
No, but I'm sure I did.
You certainly mention it in the statements at paragraph 11. In a televised interview with the BBC's Newsnight programme...
Sorry, let me get hold of that again.
Forgive me. Bottom of page 2 of your statement is up on the screen. In a televised interview with the BBC's Newsnight programme broadcast on the 4th of June 2018, I was asked questions about allegations of child sexual abuse made against Smith. I described them as scurrilous hearsay and tittle-tattle. Can we just play the clip to remind you? And the clip reference is INQ 004085. before it's played, you were actually being interviewed. I think you were in Edinburgh, but you were being interviewed by Evan Davies in presumably the London studio about Thorpe, and then he asked you some questions about Smith. Well, we're not going to look, I hope, at the Thorpe part, but hopefully we're queued up to the Cyril Smith part. Thank you.
Please.
Evan Davies, I'm sure, asked you that question without you being aware you were going to be asked it.
Exactly, and I think it was probably just after I had read the Danzig book.
Yeah. When you refer to scurrilous hearsay and tittle-tattle, you can't surely have been talking about the matters that Cyril Smith had confessed to you
No, not
all
at
those
all.
years before.
I was talking about the current, he was talking about 2018.
Yeah. So when you used the words scurrilous hearsay and tittle-tattle, you didn't have in mind the fact that Cyril Smith had confessed.
Not at all. I was talking about the Danzig book, frankly.
Which particular allegations in the Danzig book were you saying were scurrilous hearsay?
There were so many in the book.
Yeah.
I actually met with Danzig so after the book was published, and I told him I thought a lot of it was very doubtful. Anyway...
as a matter of interest, by the 4th of June, we can hear you saying that you were talking about this inquiry, and when this inquiry had finished its work. Is that what you were saying when we were just hearing you talk about the inquiry?
Was it this inquiry I was talking about?
I'm asking you.
No, I can't remember.
Had you, by the 4th of June, appreciated that in October 2017 this inquiry had 3 weeks of hearings into Cambridge House Hostel, Knoll View School and Cyril Smith and Rochdale generally? Did you know that?
I can't remember if I was aware of that at the time, but I know now that there was that inquiry, yes.
And there was a report which the inquiry published into those hearings in April 2018, just a couple of months before you were interviewed by Evan Davies. Had you read it by then?
No, I haven't read it.
Because in it, some of the allegations by the young men who made the allegations which were written up by the Rochdale Alternative paper and Private Eye were heard by the inquiry, and they were sitting in the very witness box where you are now, Lord Steele. Did you know any of that by the time you spoke to Evan Davies?
We're talking about, again, the time of the Private Eye article.
Well, you are, yes. I was asking you about the interview, but I'm talking about the same allegations, the same series of allegations.
But there were allegations referred to in Private Eye. They were not the allegations in the Danzig book.
Some of them were the same. I haven't read the book for a long time myself, so I can't bring to mind exactly the allegations which Simon Danchuk himself made. And I remember the one that you make about the parliamentary incident, which you've told us, and thank you, that can't possibly have happened because of the geography which you've mentioned. But the point I make is, at the time that you were being interviewed by Evan Davies, the inquiry had actually published a report into those matters.
I don't think I'd read that.
But you hadn't read it?
No.
Have you read it since?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't seen it.
Now, just a couple of other...
I mean, can you enlighten me? Does that inquiry justify the allegations, confirm the allegations, or what?
Well, the inquiry, if you want me to put up on screen, I'll show you.
Yeah.
If we look at the Rochdale report, it's INQ 004181.
Oh, sorry, this is going back to the Rochdale paper.
Yes, is that what you want me to tell you about?
It doesn't matter. It's okay, yeah.
That doesn't matter.
I thought you were referring to more recent ones.
No, I'm talking about this inquiry, which heard evidence from the very boys who were sexually assaulted by Cyril Smith at Cambridge House Hostel.
And what conclusion did the inquiry come to?
That their evidence was compelling.
Right. Yeah. And in other words, that the police investigation should have been pursued.
It was, yes. I mean, if you read the Rochdale investigation report, Lord Steele, you see, amongst other things, that the DPP's decision was turned around extremely quickly.
Yeah.
The police were very keen and enthusiastic that Cyril Smith should be prosecuted.
Right.
But he never was.
Yeah. Well, I knew nothing about that at the time.
May I suggest, when you have a moment, you should read the report?
Thank you very much. Okay.
Now, let me move on to something else, please. are you aware of the comments? Because I just want to tap your recollection as a whip. Are you familiar with a programme that went out in 1995 called Westminster Secret Service, in which a man by the name of Tim Fortescue gave his views about how the whip's office, certainly for the Tory party, worked?
No.
Let's see if we can play it, and I hope the volume's good enough for you to hear it. If not, I can tell you on this occasion what he actually said. It's INQ 004083.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
Thank you. Now, and do you recognise?
I didn't really hear that.
I'll tell you what he said.
Tell me the gist of it. Yes.
No, I'll tell you what he said. But did you know Tim Fortescue?
I must have done, but I didn't recognise him.
He was MP for Liverpool Garston between 1966 and 1974, and you started, I think you told us, in 1965 in Parliament.
Right.
So
I must have known him.
Yeah. Well, what he said, and this I can tell you verbatim, he said that anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, now I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal in which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help, and if we could, we did, and we would do everything we can because we would store up brownie points. And if that sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons, because if we could get a chap out of trouble, then he will do as we ask forevermore. Now, he was a Tory whip, and that he was talking about his own time, and obviously the interest, as far as this inquiry is concerned, is his reference to, in effect, covering up a scandal involving small boys, because if there was one of your flock was involved in that, you'd cover it up and he'd be yours forevermore for whatever purpose you required him in Parliament. Do you recognise that from your own experience?
I don't recognise it, but in fairness, Fortescue would have had a vast number of people to deal with. I only had a handful, and I never had any experience of that kind.
And you're saying that because of the comparative sizes of the parties?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, just a couple of other matters, please, Lord Steele, and then, as far as I'm concerned, you will be finished. First of all, behind the in the file, behind divider. Behind divider 4, please. INQ 003953. If that can go up on screen.
Yep.
Now, this is a diary, a 1988 diary for the 12th of April.
Right.
And you see at 12:30, lunch, special branch, senior officers, special functions room, 5th floor, New Scotland Yard. Here's a test of memory. Do you have any idea why you were invited to a lunch of that nature? Would that
I've looked at that and I cannot remember, but I can assume that it would be one of several briefings that other public bodies did have of MPs, and I was probably one among several MPs there. I can't remember, honestly.
Would that be a regular occurrence?
Absolutely. A frequent occurrence was branches of the public service and indeed private industry as well would host events of that kind to brief MPs about what they were doing.
More particularly, though, as far as this inquiry is concerned, special branch, was that a regular occurrence or not? Or senior police?
No, I don't think so. I think it would have been a one-off.
Would it likely have been on any particular topic or?
No, I think it would just have been about their general activities.
All right. Thank you. Now, finally, can you go, if you please, behind divider 14? And it's a document that was added today because it's come to us very recently. Have you had time to read this, Lloyd? Right at the back it should be. Divider 14, we'll put it up on screen, INQ 004197.
Well, Lord Dropling, yes, I haven't read this yet.
All right. Let me read the two paragraphs to you and how this has come about. Lord Jopling is a witness. We're going to hear from him.
Right.
But he made a statement, as you see, yesterday, the 12th of March, which he sent to the inquiry, and he says in the second paragraph, over the weekend of the 9th to the 10th of March, I read the opening statement by counsel to the inquiry, which has jogged my memory in respect of two separate issues, and these are the issues I'd like to see if you have any recollection about. Firstly, approximately 50 years ago, and 50 years ago would be 1969 or thereabouts, during a private conversation with John Cobb, QC, later Sir John Cobb, he told me in an informal capacity that he had been asked by police or the DPP to look at papers regarding child abuse allegations against Cyril Smith MP. He told me that after going through all the papers, he'd advised the police or the DPP that he didn't think there was evidence sufficiently strong to get a conviction. And Lord Jopling says, I didn't see any of the papers he was referring to. Now, pausing there, I can tell you, Lord Steele, what happened between police and the DPP was gone through during the very inquiry investigation I was telling you about. This didn't arise, and the inquiry had no information about this at all at that point.
Okay.
But paragraph 4, he says this, a few years ago, I heard that Lord Steele of Akewood was being criticised over a potential cover-up of evidence against Cyril Smith. I told Lord Steele informally about my previous conversation with John Cobb. I believe that he subsequently referred publicly to my conversation with him without naming me. I can't recall now how I heard or read that he had referred publicly to our conversation. Now, does any of that ring any bells with you?
It doesn't. I do remember Michael Jopling telling me this, yes. But I don't remember, like him, I can't say that I don't remember how I or why I would refer to that in any public occasion.
Well, he's talking about, on the face of it, and we'll have to ask him when he comes, he's talking about you being criticised over a potential cover-up of the Cyril Smith case, and because of it, Lord Jopling tells you, although the link between the two is difficult to see at the moment, he tells you about some advice he understood counsel had given to the police or the DPP all those years ago.
I think this was after all the publicity which we've dealt with earlier in the Daily Mail from Danzig's book.
Yeah, I see.
I think that's what it was.
But now you don't have any independent recollection of this conversation?
I don't know how or why I referred to it publicly at all. I can't remember that.
Yeah. Well, Lord Steele, those are all the questions I have. I'll see if the chair or the panel have any questions for you.
We have no questions, thank you. Thank you very much, Lord Steele.
There are just a couple of things. May I say to the inquiry?
Yes, please.
I don't know if you've heard of a scheme called the Disclosure and Barring Service.
Yes.
It has occurred to me, talking to colleagues recently, that it might be a good idea if political parties were to apply that system to candidates or you know, when they're coming forward for selection. It's a point the inquiry might like to consider. The other thing, which is less likely to be in your hands, is that I must say I am a bit concerned about the unqualified way in which you cannot libel the dead. The dead have got relatives and friends, and I think it's rather scandalous the way some of the things have been said about people who are not around to answer.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Lord Steele. Well, your comments are on the record.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
And
Thank you.
Very important inquiry, and I wish you well.
Thank you very much. Chair, I don't think we've got anything to reduce. Have we? Chair, that's all the evidence for today. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you.